She's fat, she's poor, and she's just been sold by her family to pay off debts. Abigail Brooks, 19 years old, never once looked at with respect, walks to the altar with a heart already dead. The man waiting for her there is Gideon Mercer, the richest man in the frontier. Everyone knows he didn't choose her, he only accepted her. But on her first night at his farm, something happens that she can't understand. Follow the story to the end, like, and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The dress didn't fit right, and Abigail had known it wouldn't. She'd stood in the back room of the church while her mother tugged at the seams with fingers that couldn't quite keep still, pulling the fabric tighter across the shoulders, smoother across the waist, as if the right amount of yanking might transform her daughter into something more suitable for the occasion. The dress was ivory with a ribbon of pale blue at the collar, pretty enough in the way that borrowed things are pretty. But it had been made for a woman with narrower hips and a smaller chest, and no amount of her mother's fussing was going to change that. "Stand up straight," her mother said. Abigail straightened. "It'll do," her mother said, which was the closest thing to a compliment Abigail had heard from her in a long time. Through the thin wooden wall, she could hear the shuffling of boots and the low murmur of the congregation settling into pews. About 30 people, her younger brother Thomas had told her when he'd poked his head in 10 minutes ago, his face carrying that particular expression he wore when he felt guilty about something and didn't want to say so directly. He'd looked at her dress, then at her face, then back at the door, and said, "It won't be so bad, Abby," which told her plainly that he thought it might be. She pressed her palm flat against the wooden wall and breathed. Gideon Mercer. She'd seen him twice in her life. Once at the grain market in Caldwell Creek when she was 15, and once at the county land office last spring, where he'd been arguing with a clerk about a boundary survey in a voice that wasn't loud but carried the kind of certainty that made the air feel different in a room. He was older than her by at least 15 years, tall in the way that some men are without seeming to try for it, with a face that wasn't handsome exactly but was composed, settled, like a landscape that had already decided what it was going to be. She didn't know him. She didn't know anything about him except what the town said. And the town said plenty. Richest rancher on the frontier, 6,000 acres of the best grazing land in the territory. A house with 2 floors and glass windows. A man who'd never married, never seemed to particularly want to, until now. And no one could quite figure out why he'd agreed to this arrangement, because Abigail Brooks was not the kind of girl that men like Gideon Mercer were supposed to want. She'd heard them say it. She'd heard them say worse. Her father's voice came through the wall now, low and urgent, speaking to someone she couldn't identify. He'd been drinking since breakfast, which she'd known before she'd even come downstairs that morning. She could always tell by the particular way his chair scraped against the floor when he pushed back from the table, that small grinding sound of a man trying to be careful and failing at it. The debts had been piling since the harvest failed 2 years running, and when Mercer's man had come to the house 4 weeks ago with a proposal written on good paper in careful ink, her father had called it a solution. He hadn't asked her. He'd told her. "This is what we're doing," he'd said, and her mother had nodded and looked away, and Thomas had stared at his boots, and that was the entirety of the conversation about the rest of Abigail's life. She'd cried that first night, alone in the dark with her quilt pulled over her head so no one would hear. Then she'd stopped crying, because crying hadn't ever changed much of anything for her, and she'd lain awake listening to the wind come off the plains until the gray light of morning started showing at the edge of her curtain. By the time she came downstairs to start the breakfast fire, she'd arrived at a place that wasn't quite acceptance and wasn't quite defeat. Something in between, the kind of numb stillness that comes from deciding there's nothing left to fight. She was 19 years old. She had known for years that her life was going to go a particular way because of how she looked, and this was apparently how. The door to the back room opened and her father leaned in, his face shaved close and his good jacket on, the smell of whiskey faint but present on the air between them. "It's time," he said. She picked up the small bouquet of dried wildflowers her mother had put together, purple clover and a few stalks of yellow, something she didn't know the name of, and she walked out of the room. The congregation did not stare at her all at once. They did it in pieces, in the way that people do when they're trying to seem polite while not actually being polite. A turn of the head here, a small shift of the eyes there. A woman in the third pew leaning just slightly toward the woman beside her to say something behind her hand. Abigail walked the aisle of that church and felt every one of those looks land on her like stones dropped in still water. Small, but each one sending out a ripple she couldn't stop. She didn't look at anyone directly. She looked at the front of the church, at the minister waiting with his book open, and at the man standing to the right of him. Gideon Mercer was watching her come toward him with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not pity. She knew pity well enough to recognize it on sight. Not that polite blankness that men put on when they were trying not to show disappointment. Something else. He was watching her the way a person watches something they're genuinely paying attention to, which was such an unfamiliar experience for Abigail that she nearly missed a step in the aisle. She recovered. She reached the front. She stood beside him. He was even taller than she'd remembered. He smelled like clean wool and something outdoors, pine or sagebrush. He did not look at her dress or her figure. He looked at her face, and when she finally met his eyes, he gave her a single small nod. The kind that means I see you, not the patronizing kind that means be brave, and turned back toward the minister. The service was brief. The minister spoke the words he always spoke, and Abigail repeated what she was supposed to repeat, and Gideon repeated what he was supposed to repeat, and then it was done. There was no reception. Her family had spent what little remained on the church and the borrowed dress, and Mercer's people had apparently not thought to arrange anything further or had not been asked to. A few people shook hands with her father near the door. A woman Abigail recognized as May Alderton touched her arm and said, "I hope you'll be very happy," in a voice that made it sound like a question rather than a wish. Then she was standing outside in the cold November air beside the man who was now her husband, and he was saying something quiet to a broad-shouldered man with a gray-streaked beard who had to be one of his ranch hands. He turned to her. "You'll want to say goodbye to your family," he said. It wasn't a command. It was an observation, an acknowledgement of what she might need. She went back to where her mother and father and Thomas were grouped near the church steps. Her mother hugged her tightly and didn't say anything, which undid something in Abigail's chest more than words would have. Thomas grabbed her hand. "You write to us," he said. "I will." "You really will?" "Thomas." She squeezed his hand. "I'll write." Her father said, "You're a good girl, Abby," and looked at somewhere above her head when he said it, and she understood that this was as close as he was going to get to an apology, and that she was going to have to let it be enough. She walked back to where Gideon Mercer stood waiting beside a wagon, and she climbed up onto the seat without help because she didn't want to be helped. And he climbed up on the other side, and they drove out of Caldwell Creek toward the Mercer Ranch with 30 miles of open frontier between them and nothing yet to say. He didn't push conversation on her. That was the first thing she noticed about him. There were men, her father was one of them, who couldn't tolerate silence, who filled it compulsively with talk that went nowhere, restless noise in the place of anything real. Gideon drove with their reins easy in his hands and his eyes on the road ahead, and said nothing for a long time. And the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, or wasn't only uncomfortable. It had space in it, which was different. After about 40 minutes, when the road climbed toward the ridge and the valley opened out below them into a broad sweep of brown winter grass and distant dark hills, she said, "How far is it?" "Another hour, maybe less," he said, "depending on how the creek crossing went after last week's rain." She nodded. He nodded. More silence. Then she said, because she couldn't not say it, because it had been sitting in her chest since that first meeting at the house 4 weeks ago. "You should know that I didn't choose this." She felt him turn to look at her, though she kept her own eyes forward. "I know," he said. Something in his tone made her look at him then. He wasn't defensive and he wasn't dismissive. He said it the way you say something true that you've already sat with. "You knew?" she said. "A man doesn't ride out to meet a girl whose family owes him money and not understand the situation," he said. His eyes went back to the road. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She looked at him for another moment. "Then why, that's a longer conversation," he said, "and you've had a long day." She considered arguing, because she was not generally the sort of person who let things alone, but she looked at the set of his jaw and the quiet in his face and decided that he wasn't evading her. He was telling her the truth, that the conversation was longer than a wagon ride in the cold, and that he was willing to have it. She turned back to the road. "All right," she said. They rode the rest of the way without speaking, and when they came over the last rise and the ranch spread out below them, the big house with its 2 stories, the barns and outbuildings in a loose semicircle, the winter bare cottonwoods along the creek, all of it larger than she'd let herself picture. Abigail felt the first genuine thing she'd felt all day, which was a fear more complicated and specific than the general dread that had been sitting in her since her father's announcement. This was his world, built over years, shaped by his hands and his money and his choices. She was entering it as a stranger with nothing. The wagon rolled down the slope toward the house. His housekeeper was a stout woman named Dolores, somewhere in her 50s, with iron gray hair and sharp eyes, and an expression that was not unfriendly but was cautious in the way that people are when they're reserving judgment until they have more information. She met them at the front door. "Mrs. Mercer," she said to Abigail, and the name was such a surprise that Abigail almost looked behind herself. "Dolores has been running this house for 11 years, Gideon said, which was not an introduction so much as a statement of fact that meant she knows everything about how things work here, and if you have questions, she's a better source than I am. Dolores showed her the house, the kitchen, the sitting room, the wide staircase up to the second floor. The house was not beautiful in any careful way. It was well made and practical, with thick walls and good furniture, and the kind of tidiness that comes from a person who takes pride in function over decoration. There were no frills. There were very good floors. At the top of the stairs, Dolores opened a door on the left side of the hall. "Your room," she said. Abigail stepped inside. It was a corner room, 2 windows, a bed with a blue quilt, a washstand, a good-sized wardrobe. Clean, private, properly sized. A room that had been prepared for someone to actually live in, not a courtesy space cleared out at the last minute. She turned to find Gideon standing in the doorway. "Mine's at the end of the hall," he said. "We can talk about arrangements whenever you're ready. There's no—" He stopped, chose his words. "There's no expectation. Of anything. Not yet. Not until you want there to be. If you want there to be." She looked at him for a moment, trying to find the catch in it. "Why are you being kind to me?" she said. He looked almost uncomfortable, which was the first time she'd seen anything like discomfort cross his face. "I'm not being kind," he said. "I'm being decent. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes," he said. "Kind is when you do something for someone because it makes you feel good about yourself. Decent is just the floor, the lowest level of how you treat a person." "Most people don't make it to the floor," she said. He considered this. "No," he said. "They don't." Dolores had drifted somewhere back toward the stairs with the studied discretion of someone who's learned when to disappear. Abigail looked at this room, her room, that strange phrase, and then back at this man she'd married today in a church full of people who had been quietly cruel about her for as long as she could remember, and she felt something she couldn't name shifting at some deep level beneath the numbness and the exhaustion and the fear. "Thank you," she said, for lack of anything more precise. He nodded once. "Supper's at 7, he said, and walked down the hall. She didn't come down for supper at 7. She sat on the edge of the blue-quilted bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling into evening, the low murmur of voices from somewhere below, the bang of a door somewhere outside, wind off the planes pushing at the windows, and she let herself feel all the things she'd been holding at arm's length all day, which was considerable. She was alone in a stranger's house. She was married to a man she didn't know. She had left her family, small and broken as they were, and everything about her life until this morning was now behind her in a way that couldn't be reversed. The dress that didn't fit was hanging over the wardrobe door. Her one bag sat in the corner. She had $42 she'd saved over 3 years of mending work, sewn into the lining of her coat. She had been sold. Not harshly, not cruelly, but that was what had happened, and she needed to let herself know it clearly before she could figure out where to put it. She sat with it for a while, that knowledge, and then she stood up, and she changed out of the borrowed dress into her own clothes, and she washed her face at the washstand, and she looked at herself in the small mirror hung on the wall. She was not what anyone had ever wanted her to be. She had a round face and wide hips and a body that had been the subject of commentary all her life, from the children at the schoolhouse who'd been sharp and direct about it, to the adults in town who were more circuitous but not actually kinder. She had hair that was decent, a dark reddish brown, and eyes that were a clear gray-green, and she'd been told once by a woman at the mercantile that she had a lovely face, which had been intended as a compliment but landed differently when you understood the implied contrast. She looked at herself until she stopped seeing what other people had told her to see, and she saw what was there, a tired girl, 19 years old, who had just walked into something with no map and no guarantee, and the only thing she owned clearly was herself. That was enough to start with. She went downstairs. Chum. Gideon was still at the table, working through a bowl of stew and a stack of papers he'd pushed to the far edge to make room for eating. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "I thought you might be hungry after all," he said, without any particular inflection about her lateness or her absence. "I'm sorry about the time." "It's your house," he said. "You eat when you eat." Dolores materialized from the kitchen with a bowl and bread that was still warm, and Abigail sat down across from Gideon and ate, because she was hungry, genuinely, properly hungry, in a way she hadn't noticed until the food was in front of her. And he worked through his papers, and neither of them performed conversation at the other, and the stew was good. After a while she said, "Tell me about the ranch." He looked up from the papers. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite surprised, but close to it, as if he'd expected her to ask about something else, or not ask at all. "What do you want to know?" "All of it," she said. "What you run. How many men. What the problems are." She tore a piece of bread. "If I'm going to live here, I should know what I'm living in." He put down the papers. He talked for an hour, not in the way that men sometimes talk to women about work, simplified, edited, stripped of the parts they assume won't be understood, but straight, the way he'd talk to a foreman. 600 head of cattle, currently down to 420 after a rough summer. 3 full-time ranch hands, 2 seasonal. Creek crossing that flooded every spring and had taken out a fence section 2 years running. A section of north pasture with soil trouble he hadn't fully diagnosed. The contracts he had with a beef buyer in Wichita that were solid but would come up for renegotiation in March. She listened. She asked questions. When he mentioned the north pasture, she said her family had had trouble with similar soil on a stretch of land before they'd lost it, and that the problem had turned out to be drainage. Underlying hardpan that sat too close to the surface and held water against the roots. He stopped and looked at her. "You know about soil drainage," he said. "I grew up on a failing farm," she said. "You learn about soil drainage because you're trying to figure out what's killing everything." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll show you the pasture tomorrow if you want to have a look." "All right," she said. They finished the evening in that way, not comfortably exactly, but honestly, which was something more durable anyway. When she said goodnight and climbed the stairs to her room, she sat again on the edge of the blue quilted bed. But this time what she felt was different from what she'd felt before. She still didn't know him. She was still in a stranger's house at the end of a day that had changed everything about her life without asking her permission. She still had $42 sewn into the lining of her coat, and she still understood that she was here because her father had needed a solution to a problem that had nothing to do with her. But she also knew his name now in a different way than she had this morning. She knew that he had cattle and drainage trouble and contracts coming due in March. She knew that he talked to her like a person, without embellishment or condescension, which was rarer than it should have been. She didn't trust him. That would take longer, and she wasn't going to shortcut it. But she lay down on the bed and pulled the blue quilt up and listened to the wind off the plains, and for the first time in 4 weeks she didn't cry herself to sleep. She was still awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling in the dark, turning over everything she didn't yet understand about this man and this place and whatever her life was going to become here. But somewhere in the small hours the thinking got quieter, and the wind settled, and the darkness of a prairie winter pressed gently at the windows, and she slept. The north pasture was worse than he'd described. Abigail pulled her boot from the mud and looked at the standing water pooled between the grass tufts, pewter-colored in the low November light. The grass was sparse where it should have been thick, and in a stretch along the middle of the field it had given up entirely, leaving a patch of bare, gray-brown ground the size of a house. Gideon stood beside her with his hat in his hands and his coat collar up against the wind. He'd brought her out here first thing after breakfast without ceremony. She'd come downstairs to find him already eating, and he'd simply said, "Ready to see that pasture?" And she'd put on her coat. She walked to the bare patch and crouched, pressing her fingers into the soil. It came up heavy and wet, darker than it should have been, with a clay-smooth texture underneath the surface layer. "There," she said, and pushed her fingers down until she hit resistance about 4 inches down. "Right there. That's your problem." He crouched beside her. She pressed his hand down to the same depth and he felt it, the hard, impermeable layer sitting just under the surface, blocking drainage, holding moisture against the roots until they drowned. "Son of a—" He caught himself, then looked at her sidelong, slightly embarrassed. "I've heard worse," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but she saw it. "What do you do for it?" he said. "You can break it up. Deep plow, go down past it, let the water through. Takes work. And then you probably need to reseed because whatever was up here is already dead." She stood and wiped her hand on her coat. "Or you can drain it. Cut a drainage channel along the low edge there. Give the water somewhere to go. That's faster. You know how to lay drainage line?" She thought about her father's farm, the summer when she was 14 and the south field had been dying and her father had been too deep in a bottle to figure out what to do about it. And she'd gone to the county extension office herself, alone. And the man there had looked surprised to see a girl asking soil questions but had answered her anyway. She'd come home and drawn it out on paper and then done it herself over 3 weekends because there was no one else. "I know the theory," she said. "I've done it on smaller scale. This is bigger. I've got 2 men I could put on it." He looked at the bare patch. "If you were willing to direct it." She looked at him. "You'd take directions from me. On this?" He met her eyes. "Yes, you know more about it than I do." She considered that for a moment. The plainness of it, the absence of any performance of humility, just the bare acknowledgement of a fact he had no reason to obscure. "All right," she said. They walked the fence line after that, Gideon pointing out the section that flooded each spring, and she looked at the lay of the land and the direction the creek ran and said she thought she understood the problem. And he listened and asked questions, and they came back to the barn with cold hands and mud on their boots and more than they'd had between them the night before. Dolores had coffee ready, and they drank it standing at the kitchen table, not at the table standing beside it, still in their coats, talking about the fence. And neither of them noticed until the coffee was gone that they'd been talking for 20 minutes without it costing either of them anything. That was how the first week went. Not perfectly, not smoothly. There were long silences that were awkward rather than easy. And there were moments when Abigail would look up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't parse, and moments when she caught herself doing the same to him. And there was the night when she heard him arguing in a low, fierce voice outside with one of the ranch hands about something she couldn't make out, and she'd lain awake wondering if the quiet decency he showed her was specific to her, or just the way he moved through the world, and not being sure which answer she hoped for. On Thursday, a woman named Clara Hobbs came to call. She was about 40, thin-faced and proper, with the look of someone who thought quite well of herself and had arranged her life to confirm that view. She sat in the front room with tea that Dolores brought and said all the things that women like her say in a tone that made them sound like kindness while meaning something else entirely. "You must be finding it all such a change," she said to Abigail. "Such a big house after, well," a small smile. "And Gideon is so particular about things. We were all quite surprised when we heard, of course, though I suppose a man of his age is ready to settle." Abigail drank her tea. "We all think it's lovely," Clara continued, "though, of course, everyone was quite, well, marriage is such a personal thing, isn't it? Everyone makes their own choices, though, of course, you'll want to find your place here. It takes time to fit into a community that's been established so long." "I imagine it does," Abigail said. "And of course you mustn't feel, well, people are curious. They'll come around in time." Another small smile. "It's just that Gideon has been, people are very fond of him here, and they want—" She trailed off with the look of someone who has come to the end of what they're willing to say directly and is hoping you'll understand what they couldn't quite bring themselves to say. Abigail understood perfectly. What Clara wanted her to understand was that the community was watching, that they hadn't expected this, that they weren't sure she was adequate to what was expected of a woman in Gideon Mercer's position, and that she would need to earn whatever welcome she might eventually receive. She said, "It's very kind of you to call." Clara left 20 minutes later, satisfied that she'd discharged her social obligation and said her piece, however indirectly. Abigail stood at the window and watched the buggy roll down the lane toward the road and felt the particular exhaustion of having been told something important in language designed to allow the speaker to pretend they hadn't said it. She heard Gideon's boots on the stairs. He'd been up in the study when Clara arrived and had apparently heard the buggy and decided to stay out of it, which told her he knew exactly what that kind of visit looked like. He came to stand beside her at the window. "Clara Hobbs," he said. "She says everyone is curious," Abigail said. "Clara Hobbs is curious," he said. "She calls it everyone." Abigail almost laughed. It wasn't funny, not really, but the precision of it caught her off guard. "You don't need to go into town until you're ready," he said. "And when you do, you don't need to go alone." She looked at him. "I'm not afraid of them," she said. "I didn't say you were." You meant it kindly," she said. "But I need you to know I'm not afraid of them. I've been not good enough for people my entire life. I'm used to it." He looked at her for a moment. That quiet, attentive look she was beginning to understand was just how he was, the way some men are when they're actually listening rather than waiting for their turn. "That's not something anyone should be used to," he said. She turned back to the window. The lane was empty now, Clara's buggy gone around the bend. "No," she said. "It isn't." Neither of them said anything for a while. The wind had come up again outside, bending the leafless cottonwoods along the creek, and the light was going gray and thin toward afternoon. Then he said, "There's a fence section in the South 40 that needs restringing before the first hard freeze. I could use another set of hands if you're willing." She knew what he was doing, giving her something with her hands to do, something that had nothing to do with Clara Hobbs or the community or anyone's opinion of her, something that was just work and weather and the good simplicity of a problem that could be solved. She appreciated it more than she knew how to say. "I'll get my coat," she said. The fence line in the South 40 ran along the base of a low ridge where the ground was hardest, and by the time they'd restrung the third section, the cold had worked its way past Abigail's coat and into her shoulders. She didn't say so. She held the wire taut while Gideon worked the staple gun, and she learned quickly that the trick was keeping her grip even when the wire wanted to spring back, which it always did, and that you had to anticipate the tension rather than just react to it. "Other side," he said, and she moved around the post and held the wire from the new angle, and he stapled it, and they moved to the next post. They worked like that for 2 hours, not talking much, the kind of silence that builds between people who are figuring out how to work alongside each other, testing where the edges are, learning the other person's rhythm. He was efficient without being rushed, and he didn't explain things she didn't need explained. And when she made a mistake on the fourth section and let the wire slip and it twanged back and caught her palm through her glove, he just said, "You all right?" And when she said yes, he handed her a better grip position on the next run without comment. The cold got worse toward dusk. They loaded the tools back onto the wagon and drove back toward the barn in the failing light, and Dolores had beef stew again. She made it every Thursday, Abigail would later learn, a fact that carried the comfortable weight of a household routine that had existed long before her arrival and would continue regardless. She ate 2 bowls and didn't apologize for it. That night she wrote to Thomas. She told him the house was large and warm and that the housekeeper was capable and not unkind. She told him she'd spent the afternoon restringing fence line. She did not tell him about Clara Hobbs or about the particular quality of the silence in the house after supper when she and Gideon sat in the same room without quite knowing how to be in the same room, or about the way she sometimes caught herself watching him and then looking quickly away. She told Thomas the truth, just not all of it, which was the only kind of truth she'd been able to manage lately. She sealed the letter and set it on the hall table to go out with the morning post. Then she went upstairs and lay in the dark and listened to the wind, which was becoming familiar now in the way that a sound becomes familiar. Not comfortable exactly, but known, no longer alarming in its strangeness. 3 weeks in, and this was her life. Winter arrived properly in the second week of December, not gradually, but all at once, the way it does on the frontier, a mass of cold air rolling down off the northern plains overnight, and by morning the temperature had dropped 30 degrees, and the first real snow was coming in sideways across the flats. Abigail stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched it come, the gray-white curtain of it moving across the open land, swallowing the far fence line and then the nearer one, and then the barn was just a dark shape in the white. Gideon was already out there. He'd been up at 4, she'd heard his boots on the stairs, heard the back door, and by the time she'd come down at 6, he was gone. She put coffee on and set bread to warm and waited. He came in at 7 with snow in his collar and a look on his face that told her something had gone wrong before he said anything. 2 cows in the north pasture didn't come in last night, he said, pulling off his gloves. Walt and Hector are out looking, but the snow's bad. The pasture with the drainage problem? East end of it, yeah. She set a cup in front of him. If they were grazing the east end, they might have gone into the draw. There's a natural windbreak where the land drops. I saw it when we walked the fence. He looked at her. The ravine. It's where I'd go if I were cold and confused, she said. He was back out the door in 40 seconds. She watched from the window, and 40 minutes later he came back across the white field with Walt and Hector and 2 cows moving slowly in front of them, and whatever relief she felt at seeing it surprised her by its strength. He didn't mention it at breakfast. He came in and dried off and drank more coffee and ate what she'd kept warm, and she didn't make anything of it because it wasn't anything to make something of. She'd known where the cows might be, and she'd said so, that was all. But she was aware, in a way she hadn't been before, that what she knew about land and weather and the behavior of cold, hungry animals had actual use in this place, that she was not merely present but functional, that the knowledge her difficult years on a failing farm had given her was not worthless after all, just waiting for terrain where it could be applied. Good call on the draw, Walt said to her when he came through the kitchen for more coffee. He was a compact, weathered man in his 50s with a face like old saddle leather, and the compliment came out matter-of-fact, the same way he might have said, good call about a fence repair. She understood that was the best kind. Thank you, she said. He took his coffee and went. The town of Caldwell Creek was about 12 miles from the ranch, a proper town by frontier standards, 2 mercantiles, a bank, a doctor's office, a post and telegraph office, 3 churches, a hotel that doubled as a saloon in the evenings when the proprietor thought no one respectable was watching. The main street ran east-west, and on Saturday mornings it filled up with ranch families and homesteaders coming in to collect their mail and resupply and see other human beings after a week of not seeing any. Abigail had been to town twice since the wedding, both times with Gideon, both times brief and purposeful. The post office, the dry goods, back to the wagon. She had felt the attention on her both times with that now familiar sensation of small stones landing in still water. People were polite. They were politely curious. A few women had spoken to her with the careful warmth of people being consciously fair-minded, and she had been grateful for it while also understanding that fair-minded is not the same as welcoming. She knew what they said when she wasn't there. She knew because Dolores, who was not a gossip but was a realist, had mentioned one afternoon while they were putting up the last of the apple preserves that there was talk in town about the marriage. She'd said it in a tone that was both gentle and direct, the way you tell someone something you think they need to know, even though you'd rather not be the one saying it. What kind of talk? Abigail said, not really asking. The usual kind, Dolores said. People saying he could have done better. Abigail kept her eyes on the jar she was sealing. And what do they say about why he didn't? Dolores was quiet for a moment. Some say he felt sorry for your family. Some say the debt arrangement left him no choice either. She paused, measured. Some say worse things. About the way I look. Yes. Abigail nodded. She twisted the lid on the jar and set it on the shelf and reached for the next one. Do people say those things to his face? She said. Not directly. Dolores handed her the next jar. But there's a way of saying something to a man about his wife that doesn't name itself. Abigail understood. Men like Gideon didn't get told directly that people thought he'd made a mistake. They got a particular kind of sympathy, concerned and careful and just slightly pitying, that said the same thing without ever forming the words. Has he said anything to you about it? She asked. No, Dolores said. He wouldn't. Because he agrees with them? Dolores gave her a look that was almost sharp. Because he doesn't think it's anyone's business, including mine. Well, she asked him about it that night. Not directly. She approached it the way she'd learned to approach most things with him, sideways, watching for the angle that would let her see the truth rather than the version of it that would close him off. They were in the sitting room after supper, Gideon with a county land survey open on the table, and Abigail with a mending basket she'd appointed herself in the absence of other evening occupation. The fire was going. Outside, the wind was moving snow against the windows in a low, continuous sound. "Do you hear what people are saying in town?" she said. He didn't look up from the survey. "Depends which people." "About us, about why you, about the marriage." He set down his pencil. "Some of it." "And?" He looked at her across the table. In the firelight, his face was harder to read than it was in daylight, more shadow in it. "And nothing," he said. "People in small towns talk. I've lived here 20 years. I know what they do." "They think you settled," she said, "that you took what you could get because of the debt arrangement and because no one else was available." He held her gaze. "Is that what you think?" She considered the question honestly. "I think you made a practical decision that solved a problem," she said. "I don't know if it was more than that. Would it matter to you if it were only that?" She thought about it. "It would matter to me to know the truth," she said. "It wouldn't change my situation, but I'd rather know what I'm actually in than be uncertain." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow kept pressing against the glass. Then he said, "The debt is real. The arrangement was your father's proposal, not mine. When his man came to me, I said, I'd meet you first. You could have just taken the land as payment." "Yes," he said, "but you didn't." "No." "Why?" Another quiet stretch. He picked up the pencil and set it down again, which was the only restless gesture she'd seen him make. "Because I am 40 years old," he said, "and I have built this ranch from 40 acres and a leaking barn, and I have done it by myself. And there is a particular kind of a loan that comes with that, which I don't recommend to anyone." He looked at the survey, not at her. "I'm not telling you that makes me some kind of romantic. I'm telling you what's true." Abigail looked at the fire. "So you wanted a wife," she said. "I wanted a person," he said. "In the house. At the table. Someone to talk to about the land." He glanced at her. "You know more about soil than any woman I've ever met, and most men." "That's a low bar where I come from," she said. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the close cousin of one. "Maybe," he said, "but it's also just true." She nodded slowly. "And the rest of it? The town? The talk? The town can say what it wants," he said, and the way he said it had a finality to it that wasn't anger but was solid, like a wall built in the right place. "I don't run my life by what they think I should want." She went back to her mending. He went back to his survey. The fire popped once and settled lower. After a while, she said, "You should know something." She kept her eyes on the work in her hands. "I'm not going to be invisible here. I'm not going to stay in the house and let people pretend I'm not part of this." She pulled a thread tight. "I want you to know that now, so it doesn't surprise you when it happens." He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "I didn't think you would be." "People will talk worse before they talk better," she said. "Probably." "And you're all right with that?" He looked up from the survey and met her eyes straight on. "Abigail," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name without any formality around it. Just her name, plain. "I didn't marry you to keep you quiet." She looked at him. "All right," she said. No. Christmas came to the ranch with more snow and a small box of things her mother had sent. A jar of her apple butter, a pair of knitted socks, a handkerchief with an embroidered corner that had been her grandmother's. Abigail sat on the edge of her bed with the box open on her knees and pressed the handkerchief flat against her palm and let herself miss home in a concentrated way for about 10 minutes, and then she put the handkerchief in the top drawer of the wardrobe and went downstairs to help Dolores with the dinner. Gideon had given her a gift. It was sitting on the table at breakfast, wrapped in brown paper, tied with string, handed over without preamble or performance. She'd opened it to find a leather-bound field notebook, thick pages, good binding, with a small pencil tucked in the spine. For the drainage work, he said, and whatever else you want to record. She'd looked at it for a moment. It was a serious gift. Not decorative, not the kind of thing a man gives a woman to be charming, but a functional object that presupposed she was going to do functional things. Thank you, she said. He nodded and went back to his coffee. She'd used it that same afternoon, walking the north pasture with the field notebook open in the cold, sketching the drainage problem and the proposed channel route, making notes about soil depth and the direction of fall in the terrain. Her handwriting in the cold was cramped and angular, worse than usual, but she could read it, and what she was writing was accurate, and that was what mattered. Walt had come by while she was working, ostensibly to check on the fence line, actually to see what she was doing. He looked at the notebook over her shoulder with an expression of careful neutrality. Boss asked me to help with the drainage project, he said. When can you start? Day after the holiday. Good, she said. I'll have the channel route marked by then. He looked at the sketch in the notebook, and she saw him make a small internal adjustment of some kind, a recalibration of what he'd expected to find when he came over here. He'd expected, she thought, to be humoring her. He looked at the sketch, which was detailed and measured, and he wasn't humoring her anymore. All right, he said, and turned back to the fence, The work on the drainage channel started in the first week of the new year, when the ground had frozen enough to make the digging difficult but not impossible, and Abigail worked it with Walt and a younger hand named Pete, who was 18 and couldn't quite figure out what to make of her, and had settled on cautious respect as the safest position. The work was cold and physical, and she was sore every evening in muscles she hadn't used in that particular combination before, but the soreness had a quality of being earned that she found she didn't mind. Gideon came out to check the progress on the third day. He walked the length of the channel they'd cut so far, crouching at intervals to look at the depth and the angle, and then he came to where she was standing. It's right, he said. It'll work, she said. You'll see it in spring. Water'll move instead of sitting. He looked at the channel and then at her. You've done good work here. She didn't deflect it or minimize it the way she'd spent a lifetime deflecting things. She just said, thank you, and meant it, and watched him go back to the barn. That night at supper, he mentioned to Walt and Pete that the channel work was ahead of schedule and done right. And he said it in a way that attributed it clearly to the planning, and everyone at the table understood who had done the planning. And Pete looked at her sideways with an expression of slightly awed reassessment that she found more touching than she expected. This was becoming her life. Not the life she'd imagined or been prepared for. She hadn't been prepared for any particular life. She'd been handed the one her father's failures had bought her, but a real one, with mud on her boots and cold in her fingers, and work that went somewhere and people who were beginning to know what she was capable of. It was enough. More than enough. Some days. The trouble with the town didn't wait for spring. It came in February, in the form of a woman named Harriet Voss, who was the wife of the largest dry goods merchant in Caldwell Creek, and who occupied a position of considerable social authority by virtue of being the person who knew the price of everything everyone in the county needed and could adjust the terms of credit accordingly. She was not a cruel woman in any direct way. She was, Abigail thought when she met her, the kind of woman who had simply never needed to question her own assessments because they had always been convenient to her. Abigail had gone into town alone that Tuesday. Gideon had offered to come and she'd said no because she'd meant what she said in November about not hiding, and going into town on her own was part of not hiding. She'd taken the wagon and driven herself the 12 miles on roads that were icy in the shaded sections and muddy in the open ones, and she'd gone to the post office first and then the dry goods for the supply order. Harriet Voss was behind the counter. Her daughter, a girl about Abigail's age named Louise, was at the far end cataloging stock. Mrs. Mercer, Harriet said, with the tone of someone practicing the name. We don't see you in town often. I've been busy at the ranch, Abigail said, and handed over the supply list. Harriet looked at the list. My, this is a long order. We're at the end of winter supplies, Abigail said. Of course. Harriet began pulling items, moving with the efficient ease of someone in their own territory. How are you finding things out at the Mercer place? It must be quite a change from... She let it trail, the blank at the end doing the work she didn't want to do openly. From my family's farm? Abigail said. Yes, considerably larger operation. I imagine. Harriet set a sack of flour on the counter. And Gideon? He must be keeping busy. Always, Abigail said. Louise had drifted closer from the far end of the store, with the look of a young woman who found this interaction interesting. I heard you've been doing some work on the land, Harriet said. Some kind of drainage project? Her tone carried in it a small but definite note of, not mockery, but something adjacent to it, a mild incredulity at the notion. The north pasture had a drainage problem, Abigail said. I worked out the solution and directed the channel work. It'll hold the ground stable for next season. Harriet looked at her with an expression that was perfectly pleasant and contained within it the complete record of her assessment. How resourceful, she said. It needed doing, Abigail said. Louise said, from closer than Abigail had realized, How did you know how to do that? She was direct about it, no barb in the question, just genuine curiosity. Abigail looked at her. I grew up working land, she said. You learn what you have to. Louise nodded slowly, with the look of someone filing this information in a different place than where she'd initially stored it. Harriet wrapped and tallied the order in that particular silence of someone who has said what they meant to say and is now performing competence to fill the air. Abigail paid, loaded the supplies into the wagon, and drove back to the ranch. She was halfway home before the tightness in her chest loosened enough for her to breathe fully. Not because Harriet Voss had said anything especially wounding. She hadn't, not directly, but because of the energy it took. The constant vigilance of being in a space where the baseline assumption was that you were less than, and having to hold yourself steady inside that without showing that it cost you. She pulled into the barn and sat in the wagon for a moment before climbing down. Gideon appeared from the far end of the barn where he'd been working on a harness. He looked at her. How was town? He said. Fine, she said. Got everything on the list. He looked at her a moment longer, that attentive look he had, and then he came and started helping her unload the supplies without asking, and she was grateful for it in a way that was sharp and sudden and that she didn't entirely expect. Harriet Voss, he said, carrying a sack of flour toward the house. She picked up the next load. Among others. She's not a bad person, he said. She's just... I know what she is, Abigail said. You don't need to defend her. I wasn't defending her. You were explaining her. He was quiet for a moment. I was, he said. You're right. I'll stop. They finished unloading in the kind of silence that had become comfortable between them. The working silence. The silence of two people doing a task together who don't need to perform anything for each other. When the last of the supplies were in the kitchen and Dolores had taken inventory and started dinner, Abigail pulled off her coat and hung it on the peg and turned around to find Gideon still in the kitchen, which was unusual. He was normally out again already, back to whatever the ranch needed. He was looking at her. You know, he said, what they say about you, it doesn't have anything to do with what you actually are. She looked at him. I know that, she said. Do you? She thought about it honestly. Most of the time, she said. Some of the time it gets under my skin anyway, because I've heard it my whole life, and it doesn't matter how clearly you understand that something's wrong. Some part of you still flinches. He nodded slowly. What I don't want, she said, is pity. That's not what I'm offering. What are you offering? He was quiet for a moment. Accuracy, he said. The facts, as I see them. Which is that you solved a pasture problem that had been costing me cattle for 3 years. You directed drainage work that 3 grown men couldn't have planned, and you went into town by yourself today knowing what was waiting for you, and you went anyway. He held her gaze. That's a different kind of woman than what they see. She felt something shift in the space between them, not dramatically, not the way things shift in stories, with some clean emotional break into clarity, more like a plate settling, a foundation adjusting by small degrees to the weight on it. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coat and went back out to the barn, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment in the smell of Dolores's dinner coming from the stove, and outside the February wind was hard and cold and continuous, and the house held it out the way a good house holds out weather, not dramatically, just solidly, by virtue of being built right. She didn't love him. She wasn't going to name something that wasn't formed yet, that was still in the process of deciding what it was. But she trusted him. She was sure of that much. She trusted him in the specific way that you trust a person who tells you accurate things without embellishment, who treats you like someone with worth without needing to announce that they're doing it. That was more than she'd had from most people in her 19 years. She went to help Dolores with dinner, and the evening moved toward night the way evenings do on the frontier in February. Slowly, with the dark coming down early, and the house getting warmer against it, and the sound of boots in the hallway and the clatter of a table being set, and the low voices of people who are beginning, without quite deciding to build something ordinary together. In March, a letter came from her brother Thomas. She read it at the kitchen table before Gideon came in for breakfast. Thomas wrote that their father's health was worse, that the farm was not recovering, that their mother was managing but barely, and that a man from the bank had come by twice about the remaining debt, the portion that Abigail's marriage had not covered. She folded the letter and set it on the table. When Gideon came in, he looked at her face and then at the letter. "From your brother?" he said. "Yes." He poured his coffee and sat down across from her. "What is it?" She told him plainly, her father's health, the bank, the remaining debt. She didn't dress it up, and she didn't ask for anything, because she hadn't decided yet if she was going to ask for anything. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How much?" "I don't know exactly. Thomas doesn't say the number." "Can you find out?" She looked at him. "Gideon, you don't have to, Mum." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm asking if you can find out the number." She looked at him for a long moment. He was drinking his coffee and looking at the table, giving her space to decide how she felt about this without the weight of his eyes on her. "I'll write to Thomas today," she said. He nodded. She did write that day, and the reply came back in 12 days, and the number was not as large as she'd feared. She showed it to Gideon. He looked at it and said he'd have a bank draft sent by the end of the week, and she said she'd find a way to pay him back, and he said, "It's not a loan, Abigail, it's family." And the word family in that context did something unexpected to her composure that she controlled only by picking up her field notebook and going out to check on the pasture. Outside in the March cold, with the first thin green showing at the edges of the drainage channel where the ground was beginning to breathe right again, she stood and looked at the land and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, something more durable than happiness. She felt like she was somewhere she was supposed to be, and it was not a feeling she'd had much practice with, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. She wrote it in the field notebook. Not the feeling, she wouldn't have known how to write that. But the condition of the drainage channel, the color of the new growth, the direction of the wind, the temperature, all the observable facts of where she was standing and what was happening around her. The notebook was half full already. She turned the page and kept writing. Spring came to the Mercer Ranch the way it always did on the frontier. Not gently, not all at once, but in argument with itself. Warm days collapsing back into frost, the creek running high and brown with snowmelt one week and dropping to a clear trickle the next. The cottonwoods along the bank leafed out in pale green, and the pasture grass came up thin at first and then thicker, and in the north field where Abigail had directed the drainage work all winter, the ground firmed up the way she'd said it would, and the grass filled in over the bare patch with a density that made Walt stop and look at it one morning with an expression she'd learned to read as his version of impressed. "Channel's holding," he said. "It'll hold," she said. He nodded once and moved on, and that was enough. The cattle had been moved to the north pasture in the second week of April, and they spread across the new grass with that particular bovine indifference to history that Abigail found oddly comforting. They didn't know or care that the ground under their feet had been a problem for 3 years. They just ate what was there. The practical result was visible within 2 weeks. The herd's conditions started improving, less energy wasted moving between sparse patches, better weight coming on. Gideon tracked it in his ledger and said nothing directly to her about it, but she noticed that when he talked to Walt about the north pasture now, he used the present tense. Not what it had been, but what it was. She'd taken to rising earlier than she used to, sometimes before Gideon, which she knew because she would find the kitchen still dark and the coffee pot cold. She liked the first hour of morning on the ranch. The particular quality of light coming up over the eastern ridge, the sound of the ranch hands starting their day in the barn, the smell of the land warming. She would make coffee and take it outside and stand on the back step in her coat and let the morning happen around her. And she was aware during those quiet minutes that she had stopped feeling like a guest. She hadn't announced that to anyone. It wasn't the kind of thing you announced. It was just a fact that had settled into her bones somewhere between the drainage work and Thomas's letter and all the ordinary days in between, like sediment coming to rest at the bottom of still water. Thomas had written again in April, and the news was better. Their father's health had stabilized. The bank draft from Gideon had cleared the remaining debt. Their mother had taken in 2 boarders to help with income. Thomas himself had found day work at a mill in town. The family was not thriving, but it was surviving, and survival was not nothing. She wrote back each time. She told Thomas about the pasture and the cattle and the spring planting in the kitchen garden she'd started behind the house. Tomatoes and beans, and a row of herbs that Dolores had strong opinions about, which made for a negotiation that Abigail was fairly sure she was losing. She told him that the ranch was good and the work was good and that she was well. She did not tell him about Gideon's habit of leaving the field notebook on the kitchen table when he found something she'd missed, open to the relevant page, with a small penciled notation beside it. Never a correction, always an addition. A piece of information she hadn't had, like a property survey mark or a water table measurement. She did not tell him about the evening in late March when a spring storm had taken out 3 sections of the east fence, and she and Gideon had worked in the rain for 4 hours to get them back up. And that when they'd finally come back to the house soaked through, Dolores had taken one look at them and put 2 bowls of soup on the table without a word, and they'd sat there steaming and muddy and slightly ridiculous looking. And Gideon had looked at her from across the table and said, "You're a hard woman to keep up with." And she had laughed. Actually, laughed. The first time in months she'd laughed at something without first calculating whether it was safe to. She didn't tell Thomas that part because she didn't have the words for what it meant yet, and she had learned over a lifetime of careful self-protection not to name things before she understood them. What? The church social was Louise Voss's idea, though Abigail didn't know that until later. It was an established thing, the first Saturday social of spring held at the larger of Caldwell Creek's 3 churches, which had a meeting hall attached that served the community for events ranging from town planning meetings to harvest celebrations. Families came from 20 miles out. There was food and music and the general loud business of people who had been isolated through a frontier winter emerging into the longer light of spring with the accumulated energy of months spent mostly indoors. Abigail had not attended the previous fall's social. She'd been too new, too uncertain, and Gideon hadn't pushed it, had simply said it was her choice, which she had appreciated and taken up entirely. This time she decided differently. She made the decision on a Tuesday, gave herself until Saturday to change her mind, and didn't change it. She told Gideon at breakfast on Friday. "The spring social tomorrow," she said. "I'd like to go." He looked up from his coffee. "All right." "By myself," she said. A pause. "All right," he said again in the same tone, and went back to his coffee, and she understood that he understood what she was doing and was not going to make a production of it. She wore her good dress, which was a deep blue wool she'd bought at Voss's Dry Goods in February, with her own money from the mending work she still took on, because old habits don't dissolve completely just because circumstances change. It fit her well. She'd made sure of that, having learned from the wedding that wearing things that didn't fit made everything harder. She pinned her hair up properly and looked at herself in the mirror and decided she looked like herself, which was the only result she'd been aiming for. She drove herself. The 12 miles in the spring morning, the road dry and the country opening up around her, green coming in on the hillsides after the long brown of winter. She thought about what she was walking into and let herself think about it clearly, without false courage. She was walking into a room full of people who had already decided things about her, and she was walking in alone, and there was a real possibility that it was going to be uncomfortable in ways she couldn't entirely predict. She went anyway. The meeting hall was already full when she arrived. She tied the horse and wagon at the post outside and went in through the main door and was immediately in the noise and warmth of 200 people, the smell of food on long tables, the sound of a fiddle being tuned somewhere toward the back. She stood for a moment just inside the door, getting her bearings. She saw Louise Voss first across the room, who saw her at almost the same moment, and lifted a hand in something between a wave and a recognition. Abigail nodded back. That was one person. She moved further into the room. People noticed her. She felt it happening in that incremental way she was used to, the ripple of awareness moving outward from her position. Some people said hello and meant it. An older couple she recognized from a ranch adjacent to Gideon's came over, and the man shook her hand, and his wife said something warm about the spring grass coming in well this year. She talked to them for a few minutes and felt some of the tightness in her shoulders ease. Then she moved toward the food tables because she was hungry, and because standing near the food tables gave you something to do with your hands, which is one of those practical social facts that no one teaches you, but everyone eventually learns. She was filling a plate when she heard the voices. They weren't quiet about it. That was the thing she would remember afterward. They weren't even trying to be quiet, which meant either they didn't know she was close enough to hear or they didn't care, and she couldn't decide which was worse. Two women, standing on the other side of the long table, partially obscured by the arrangement of dishes between them. One she didn't recognize. One was a woman named Ruth Packard, whose husband ran cattle on the south end of the valley, who had always been polite to Abigail's face in the particular way of someone who is polite to your face as a point of personal pride. Didn't expect her to actually show up, Ruth Packard was saying, in that moderated voice that is not quite a whisper but is meant to carry only so far. I heard she can barely manage the house, the other woman said. Dolores does everything. Well, a pause. What can you expect? Gideon did the best he could with what was available to him, poor man. She's not, I feel sorry for her. I do. But it's not as if he had options with the debt arrangement. He had options, Ruth Packard said, with a certainty that suggested she knew something specific. He just made the charitable choice, or the convenient one, a low laugh. Both, maybe. Abigail stood on her side of the table and held her plate, and breathed through the particular sensation of having cold water poured slowly down the inside of your chest. She had heard things like this her entire life. She knew how they felt. She knew that in about 30 seconds, the sharpness of it would become a duller ache, and then the duller ache would become something she could function around, and she would function around it the way she always had. What she didn't do was move. She stayed where she was and breathed and let 30 seconds pass, and then she set down her plate on the table, gently, precisely, not with any drama. And she walked around the end of the table and she said, in a voice that was even, "Hello, Mrs. Packard." Ruth Packard turned. The color that came into her face when she saw Abigail told the whole story. She had not known or had not cared, and now both options collapsed into the same expression of a woman caught with nowhere to step that wasn't a mess she'd made herself. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady. Give her credit for that. "Good spring," Abigail said. "The grass is coming in well." "Yes," Ruth Packard said. "Yes, it is." The other woman had gone very still and was looking at something on the table that required her complete attention. Abigail looked at Ruth Packard for a moment. Looked at her directly, not with malice, just with the clarity of someone who is deciding what kind of person to be in this specific 30 seconds. And then she said, "Enjoy the social," and picked up her plate and walked away. Well, she lasted another hour. She talked to the older couple again, and to Louise Voss, who was genuinely warm in a way Abigail was beginning to think was real rather than performance. She ate her food. She watched a little girl of about 4 fall asleep on a pile of coats in the corner with the absolute conviction of the very young. She talked to a man named Doyle, who ran the telegraph office, and who wanted to discuss soil drainage with impressive specificity after Walt had apparently mentioned the North Pasture project at the feed store. But Ruth Packard's words kept returning to her with that particular persistence of the thing you didn't want to keep thinking about, but couldn't stop. And with them came the older, heavier weight, the accumulated record of every similar comment she'd absorbed over 19 years, the complete archive of being looked at and found wanting, of taking up space that people had strong opinions about, of existing in a body that was, to a significant portion of the people around her, a problem to be explained or a punchline waiting for its cue. She drove home in the afternoon light with that weight in her chest and the particular flat exhaustion that comes after social occasions you've had to survive rather than simply attend. She put the horse up herself and brushed him down and filled his water, and by the time she came into the house, the exhaustion had curdled into something with more edge in it, a dull, persistent anger at herself that she couldn't entirely account for, because she'd done nothing wrong. She knew she'd done nothing wrong. And yet, Gideon was in the kitchen. He'd been repairing something, A section of leather harness was spread on the table with tools beside it. He looked up when she came in. He took one look at her face. "Sit down," he said. "I don't need to sit, Abigail. Sit down." She sat. He put coffee in front of her without asking if she wanted it, and went back to the table and picked up the harness. And she understood that he was giving her silence and proximity and not demanding anything from it, which was the right call, and she appreciated it enough that some of the edge in her chest softened. After a while she said, "Ruth Packard, what did she say?" She told him, flatly, without drama, the actual words as close as she could recall them. He was quiet for a long moment. His hands had stopped on the harness. "She said that," he said. "She didn't know I was close enough to hear." "That's not a distinction that matters much," he said. "No," Abigail agreed. He set the harness down and picked up his own coffee, and she could see something working in his face, not the composure breaking exactly, but shifting, the way a sky shifts when weather is changing behind it. "I want to say something to you," he said, "and I want you to hear it as a fact, not as me trying to make you feel better." She looked at him. "You are the most capable person on this property," he said, "including me, and I mean that in the way it sounds, not as a compliment, as an assessment. You came here with nothing, and in 4 months you fixed a pasture problem that had been bleeding this ranch for 3 years, managed the drainage project better than any hand I have, and you've done it while figuring out a house and a marriage and a community that hasn't treated you right. Ruth Packard has lived in Caldwell Creek her entire life, surrounded by people who already decided she was somebody. She hasn't had to figure out a single new thing in 20 years. Abigail looked at her coffee. "That's generous," she said. "It's not generous," he said. "I told you. It's an assessment." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the thing she'd been turning over since the wagon ride home, the thing under the anger and the exhaustion. "Sometimes I think my being here hurts you. You're standing in this community." She kept her eyes on the cup. "People feel sorry for you because of me." Fun. The silence after that was long enough that she looked up. He was watching her with an expression she'd seen only a few times. Not the working through a problem look, not the composed foreman of his own life look, but something more open than that, something that cost him more to show. "That's the first thing you've said to me in 4 months that I think you actually believe that's wrong," he said. She felt that land. "I don't want to make things harder for you," she said. "You're not." "I might be." She met his eyes. "I'm not going to pretend I might not be. People's opinions about who you married could affect your contracts, your standing with the bank, how men treat you at the feed store. That's real." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "it's real, and I don't care about it." "You should care, Abigail." His voice was not loud, but it was very clear. "I have spent 40 years building something in this valley. I did not build it by making decisions based on what Ruth Packard thinks of me." He picked up the harness again. "And I'm not about to start." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his hands on the harness, steady, the hands of a man who had dug fence posts and cut timber and built something real out of ground that had offered no particular encouragement. She thought about what it meant that he'd said what he'd said, not with any great emotion, just with the flat insistence of a fact he didn't intend to negotiate. She didn't say anything more. She drank her coffee. He worked on the harness. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and moved slowly across the floor the way it does in spring, longer than winter, still carrying the clarity of cold air. But something was working in her that she couldn't yet see the full shape of. But sit. She didn't sleep well that night, not because of Ruth Packard exactly. The words had settled into their appropriate place in the long archive of similar words, ached but not acute. What kept her awake was the other thing, the quieter and more frightening calculation that had been building since the kitchen conversation. She lay on the blue quilt and stared at the ceiling and thought about what it actually meant to stay here. Not the daily reality of it, which she'd been living for 4 months and which had become, she had to admit this, not merely bearable, but genuinely something she valued. But the larger question of what she was doing to his life by being in it. The town thought he'd settled, that he'd made a charitable or convenient choice, that he could have done better and for reasons of debt or pity or simple limited options, hadn't. She'd heard it from Clara Hobbs in November. She'd heard it again today from Ruth Packard. She was hearing it every time she went to town, in the looks and the careful words and the particular quality of the social warmth aimed at Gideon when she was standing right beside him. And here was the thing that was keeping her awake. She was beginning to care about him. Not in a way she could yet name cleanly or fully. It wasn't a simple thing. It was tangled up with gratitude and respect, and the particular closeness that comes from working alongside someone through long, cold days, from learning the specific geography of another person's silences, from being seen clearly and not found wanting by someone whose opinion you'd started to value. But it was real. It was the most real thing she'd felt in a long time. And because it was real, she couldn't stop running the calculation. If she left, if she found a way to dissolve the arrangement, to go back to her family, or find some other situation, to remove herself from his life, he would recover socially within a season. People would move the story from poor Gideon who married wrong to Gideon who had the sense to recognize a mistake and rectify it. His contracts, his standing, his life in this community that he'd built over 20 years, they would be whole again, undamaged. If she stayed, she would keep mattering to him, keep being woven into his daily life, and the community would keep looking at what she was and deciding it reflected badly on him, and there was nothing she could do about that from inside the situation. She lay with this for a long time. Around 2 a.m, she got up and went to the window and stood looking out at the dark ranch, the barns and outbuildings just visible in the thin moonlight, the cottonwoods along the creek moving slightly in the night wind. She'd looked at this view hundreds of times in 4 months. She knew where the fence posts were in the dark. She knew the exact sound of the barn door's hinges and the particular creak of the third porch step, and the way the kitchen smelled different on days Dolores made bread versus days she didn't. She knew this place. It had gotten inside her without her fully noticing it happening. The bag she'd arrived with in November was still in the bottom of the wardrobe. She hadn't unpacked it entirely, a fact she'd been vaguely aware of without examining too closely. She went to the wardrobe and pulled it out and set it on the bed and stood looking at it in the dark. She could be packed and ready to leave before morning. She stood there for a long time. She had the bag half packed when she heard the creak on the landing. Not at the door. He wasn't the kind of man who would come to her door at 2 a.m. unannounced. Just the landing, the sound of someone awake who'd heard something or sensed something and had come to stand in the hallway. She stood very still. Then his voice, quiet, through the door. Abigail. Not a question, not an alarm, just her name, the way he said it when he was being direct. She didn't answer immediately. I can hear you moving around in there, he said. She looked at the bag on the bed. She looked at the room, the blue quilt, the field notebook on the nightstand, the mirror on the wall. I'm all right, she said. A pause. That's not what I asked. She sat down on the edge of the bed next to the bag. I'm thinking about leaving, she said. The silence on the other side of the door was different from his other silences. She could feel the weight of it. Can I come in? He said. She thought about it. Yes, she said. He came in. He was in his work clothes. He'd apparently not been to bed either, or had gotten up and dressed already. She couldn't tell. He looked at the bag on the bed. He looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and looked at the scene in front of him with the careful attention of a man trying to understand something before he responded to it. Because of today, he said. Ruth Packard. Because of the whole of it, she said. Ruth Packard is just the most recent. She looked at her hands. I'm hurting you're standing here. I know that. I've known it, and I've been telling myself it would change, that people would come around, but... She stopped. I don't think people come around the way I hoped they would. And I don't think it's fair to you to keep... Stop, he said. She looked up. He had crossed the room and sat down in the chair by the window. Not close to her, not crowding her, but in the room, present, looking at her directly. I need to tell you something, he said, and I need you to actually hear it. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. When you came here in November, I had a ranch and no one to come home to. I had money and land and a legitimate operation, and I also had a quality of a loan that was getting worse every year. He said it plainly, without asking for sympathy. What I have now is different. You know this place now. You're part of how it runs. When there's a problem with the land or the cattle, your voice is the first one I want to hear about it." She felt her chest go tight. "That's about the ranch," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." He held her gaze. "You know it's not." She looked at him. "I'm not good at this," he said. I haven't said things like this to people. I don't know how to say it in a way that sounds like anything other than just the facts. And the facts are that I don't want you to go. Not because of the north pasture, not because of the drainage channel or the cattle weights or any of it, because you're the first person in a very long time He stopped, looked out the window. "Who I feel like myself with, who I don't have to perform anything for." The room was very quiet. "I'm not going to tell you to stay," he said. "That would make me the same as your father, making the decision for you." He met her eyes again. "But I want you to know that you have a choice, a real one, not the one you had in November. If you stay now, you stay because you choose to, and if you go because you choose to, and either way, it's yours." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his face, not handsome, not dramatic, just honest, that particular quality of honesty that costs something to maintain. She looked at the bag on the bed. She thought about the north pasture in the morning light, green now, where it had been bare. She thought about the field notebook, half full of her own handwriting. She thought about what it felt like to laugh at the kitchen table with mud on her boots, and the way he had said, "It's not alone, it's family," and the specific sound of this house in the dark, when the whole world outside was winter. She reached over and lifted the bag off the bed. She set it on the floor. She sat back down on the blue quilt and looked at her hands for a moment, and then she looked at him. "I'm staying," she said. He let out a breath. It was not a dramatic sound. It was just the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding. "All right," he said. "Not because I have to," she said. "Because I want to." She held his gaze. "I need you to know that." "I know," he said. "And because you're the first person I've ever been around who didn't make me feel like I had to be smaller than I am in order to be acceptable." He was quiet for a moment. "You're the largest person I know," he said. "And I don't mean, I know what you mean," she said. Outside, the spring night was beginning to give up its darkest hour, the faintest gray beginning to suggest itself at the edge of the eastern ridge. The cottonwoods moved along the creek, and somewhere in the barn a horse shifted weight, and the ranch settled around them with the familiar sounds of itself. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." He stood. He moved toward the door. At the threshold he stopped and turned back, and for a moment he just stood there in the doorway looking at her, and she sat on the bed looking back at him. And the silence between them was not empty. It was the fullest it had been, loaded with everything that had just been said, and everything that was still too new to say. "Gideon," she said. "Yes." "Thank you for asking permission to come in." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile almost. "Of course," he said. He went back down this hall to his room. She lay down on the blue quilt in her clothes and pulled the edge of it over her and stared at the ceiling while the room got slowly lighter. And she felt the decision she'd made settling into her bones. Not with any particular fanfare, not perfectly, not without fear. Because she was still afraid of things. She would probably be afraid of things for a long time. Old fears don't dissolve just because new evidence contradicts them. But she had chosen, not been told, not been maneuvered, not been left with only one door. She had stood in front of an open door and chosen to close it and stay. That was new. That was, she thought, possibly the most important thing that had happened to her in 19 years. She closed her eyes. Down the hall, she heard his door close, soft, careful, the way he did everything. She listened to the ranch coming awake around her in the early morning, the birds starting up in the cottonwoods, a rooster somewhere beyond the barn making its announcement, the creak of the house as the spring warmth began to come back into the wood. She slept for 2 hours, and when she woke the sun was up and the day was already moving, and she got up and made coffee and went to the back step in her coat and stood in the morning with her cup and looked at the north pasture coming in green and strong under the spring sky. Gideon came out 10 minutes later with his own cup and stood beside her on the step, not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that the warmth of him was present. Neither of them said anything. The morning did what it did, and they stood in it together, and the cattle moved in the far pasture, and the light came fully over the ridge, and Abigail held her coffee cup in both hands and felt the ground under her feet as something more than the floor of someone else's life. The morning after she chose to stay, Abigail came downstairs to find Gideon already at the kitchen table with the county land records spread in front of him. Large folded papers, the kind surveyors produced, covered in fine lines and notations. He looked up when she came in, and the look between them had something different in it than it had before. A kind of settled acknowledgement, like two people who had been through something together and come out on the same side and were now simply continuing. She made coffee. He moved the papers to make room. Neither of them mentioned the previous night directly, which was the right call. It had been said, it didn't need to be performed. "What are you looking at?" she said, sitting down with her cup. "The north boundary line." He turned one of the papers toward her. "There's a survey discrepancy that's been sitting in the county record for 6 years. Voss pointed it out to me at the feed store last week. The recorded line doesn't match the stakes on the ground by about 40 feet. She looked at the paper. Survey work was not something she knew deeply, but she could read a map, and she could see what he meant. The recorded line ran one way, and a penciled notation in the margin suggested the physical stakes told a different story. "Whose land is affected?" "Mine, on the east end, and the Hartley place on the west." He put his finger on the notation. "If the stakes are right and the record is wrong, I lose about 2 acres. If the record is right and someone moved the stakes, Hartley loses 2 acres. Either way, it needs resolving before it becomes a legal problem." "Have you talked to Hartley?" "Not yet." He folded the paper. "He's a reasonable man. I'd rather sort it out between us than involve the county office if I can help it." She drank her coffee and looked at the folded paper and thought about the kind of problems that are straightforward when the people involved in them are honest, and how quickly they become something else when they aren't. She had grown up in a family where a single mishandled boundary dispute had contributed to the cascade of debt that had eventually sold her into this marriage, so she had opinions about land records. "Don't let it sit," she said. "Those things compound." "I know." He stood, collected the papers. "I'm riding out to Hartley's this afternoon." That was how their days had begun to go. A conversation in the morning over coffee that was as much about the business of the ranch as it was about anything else. And then a day of separate work that brought them back together in the evening to compare what had happened, what had worked, what hadn't. It had the structure of a partnership. She was aware of that word in the way she was aware of it, not avoiding it, but not committing to it fully yet either, because she had spent 19 years being careful about the words she applied to things she didn't want to lose. May moved into June, and the ranch settled into its summer rhythm. Longer days, the cattle work intensifying, the kitchen garden coming up in earnest behind the house. Abigail had expanded the garden by 1/3 from what Dolores had planted in previous years, adding 2 rows of squash and a section of root vegetables that would carry through to winter. Dolores had opinions about the squash placement, which she expressed through a series of carefully neutral statements that managed to contain within them the full weight of her disapproval, and Abigail moved the squash 3 feet to the left, and that seemed to resolve most of it. She had also taken on, quietly and without announcing it, the bookkeeping. Not the full ranch accounts, those were Gideon's and she hadn't asked to take them over, but the household accounts, the supply orders, the tracking of what they grew against what they bought, the small arithmetic of running a household of 4 people through a frontier year. She had a natural head for numbers, a fact she'd discovered out of necessity on her family's failing farm, where the numbers were always bad but still needed to be understood precisely. And she found she could see the household economy in ways that hadn't been visible before she started writing it down. One evening, she showed Gideon what she'd found. A pattern in the supply orders, where they were buying certain goods at higher price from Voss's dry goods that could be sourced cheaper from a supplier 2 towns over if they planned the order 3 weeks in advance instead of buying as needed. He looked at the numbers. "How much?" "About $60 a year," she said. "Maybe more if we expand the order to include the winter staples." He looked at her. $60. "It's not nothing," she said. "It's not nothing," he agreed. He looked back at the numbers. "How long did this take you?" "About an hour over 3 evenings." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do it. Plan the order the way you're describing." She did, and the first delivery came in on schedule, and cost what she'd calculated, and Walt found out about it somehow. She suspected Dolores and said to her one morning over the water trough, in his matter-of-fact way, "Heard you found $60 we were leaving on the table." "More or less," she said. He nodded, the way he nodded when something confirmed a view he already held. "Good," he said, and turned back to his work. That was Walt's version of high praise, and she'd learned to receive it as such. Walt, the trouble that had been building in Caldwell Creek all spring came to a head in the middle of June, on a Saturday, at the dry goods. She'd gone in alone again. She made a point of it, every 2 or 3 weeks, because the alternative was ceding the town entirely to its own worst assumptions about her, and that she would not do. She'd become familiar enough that some of the initial curiosity had become something more like routine acknowledgement. People said good morning, some people stopped to talk. The telegraph man always wanted to discuss land management, which she'd learned to budget time for. But that Saturday, there was a cluster of women near the back of Voss's store who went quiet when she came in, and the quality of the quiet was specific. She knew that quality. She moved through it and did her business. And on her way back to the wagon, she passed close enough to overhear the tail end of what Ruth Packard was saying to a woman Abigail didn't recognize. "Gideon's too proud to admit it, but everyone can see. You don't make a choice like that and not regret it eventually." The other woman murmured something. "She's done some work out there, I'll give her that," Ruth said. "But work isn't everything. A man in his position needs—" Abigail kept walking. She loaded her supplies and drove home and said nothing to Gideon about it at supper, because she'd made peace with the fact that Ruth Packard was going to keep saying Ruth Packard's things, and the only variable was whether Abigail let it eat at her from inside, which she was trying with moderate success not to. What she hadn't anticipated was that Gideon would hear it from a different direction. He came in from town 3 days later. He'd gone to the county office about the survey discrepancy, which had resolved in his favor with a resurvey that confirmed the stakes were correct and the record needed amending. And his face had a particular set to it that she'd only seen a few times. Not angry exactly, harder than usual, like something had crystallized. He sat down at the kitchen table and she sat across from him and waited, because she'd learned that he would say it when he was ready, and prompting him before that didn't help. "I ran into Carl Packard at the county office," he said. Carl was Ruth's husband. She nodded. "He made a comment," Gideon said, "about you, about the marriage." He looked at his hands on the table. He framed it as concern. That's how they always frame it. He said he hoped things were working out, and that if they weren't, people would understand. That a man could make a decision in difficult circumstances and be forgiven for it. Abigail was quiet. "He meant for me to take that as an opening," Gideon said, "to confirm that it had been a mistake, to agree with him. And I told him the ranch was doing well and that my wife had solved a drainage problem that had been costing me cattle for 3 years. He looked up. He seemed confused by that. She looked at him. "That's all you said?" "I also told him that his opinion of my marriage was not information I had any use for." He held her gaze. He didn't know quite what to do with that either. She almost smiled. No, he probably didn't. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she could see him thinking through something, not impulsively, the way some men think through problems, but methodically, the way he did everything. "This isn't going to stop," he said. "Not the way we've been handling it. They'll keep inserting themselves, finding angles." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me." "The land," he said. "Specifically, the east section, the 200 acres that border the creek. The good land, mature timber on the north end, creek access, a south-facing slope that would be good for almost anything you wanted to grow." He paused. "I want to put it in your name." She stared at him. "Not as a gift," he said quickly. "Or, it is a gift, but that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because—" He stopped, and she could see him choosing the words with the same care he applied to everything. "But just—" "'Cause if that land is yours, deeded in your name, then this community has to reckon with the fact that you are not a problem I took on out of pity or convenience. You are a landowner in this territory, with 200 acres of some of the best ground in the valley. She felt something move through her that she couldn't immediately name. Gideon, she said. It's good land, he said, better than the north pasture, better drainage, better aspect. You could do anything with it, whatever you decided. You built this ranch, she said. That land is part of what you built. And I'm choosing what to do with part of it, he said. That's how ownership works. She looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to find the catch. Not because she distrusted him, she trusted him more than she'd trusted anyone in a long time, but because a thing this large needed to be examined carefully before she accepted it. Why the church? She said. He blinked. What? You're thinking about doing this publicly, I can tell. You have a specific way of sitting when you're planning something with an audience in mind. She held his gaze. Why the church? Why not just have the deed drawn up and filed? He was quiet for a moment. Then, because a deed in a filing cabinet changes a legal record. What I'm thinking about changes something else. The story they tell, she said. Yes. She understood. A deed filed quietly would be a fact, accurate but ignorable, easily explained away by people who wanted to explain it away. A public declaration was a different order of thing. It was a statement made in front of witnesses that couldn't be quietly revised later. She also understood the risk in it. Public declarations could go wrong in ways that quiet deeds could not. If she stood up in front of the community of Caldwell Creek, and the community looked at her with the particular contempt it had been assembling for months, she would have to carry that in a very exposed way. If we do this, she said, I want to be there, not behind you, beside you. That's exactly where I want you, he said, and I want to speak. He looked at her. If you're going to make a statement about who I am to you, she said, I should be able to make a statement about who I am to myself. He held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, he said. You should. The following Sunday, the Mercer wagon was tied outside the church on Main Street by 8 in the morning, which was early enough to be noticed before the congregation assembled. Gideon had sent word to the minister, Reverend Amos Clay, 3 days prior, not explaining the full nature of what he intended, but indicating that he had a matter of community importance to address after the service. Reverend Clay had agreed with the mild apprehension of a man who has learned that when ranchers request time to speak to the congregation, the subject is rarely simple. Abigail had spent 2 days deciding what to wear. She settled on the deep blue wool, which was the best thing she owned, and which fit her well, and which she had bought with her own money, and she pinned her hair the way she'd learned to do it so it stayed through a long day. She looked at herself in the mirror on Sunday morning and did what she'd been doing since November. Looked until she saw what was there, rather than the accumulated commentary of everyone who told her what was wrong with it. She was ready before Gideon. She came downstairs to find him in the hall with his good jacket on, and he looked at her, and whatever was in his face in that moment, she filed somewhere she intended to return to later. They rode to town together. The service was ordinary. Reverend Clay preached about community and responsibility, which in retrospect had an accidental aptness to it that Abigail thought he probably appreciated later. The congregation settled through the hymns and the scripture and the prayers with the comfortable ease of people moving through a ritual they knew well. Then Reverend Clay said, "Mr. Mercer has asked for a moment before we close," and the register of the room changed in the way it does when something outside the ordinary script is about to happen. Gideon stood. He was not a man who performed things. He didn't clear his throat or adjust his jacket or wait for silence beyond what it took for the room to settle. He just stood and looked at the congregation, at the faces he'd known for 20 years, the families he'd done business with, the men he'd worked alongside, the women who had spent 8 months forming and circulating opinions about his wife. And he spoke. "Most of you know me," he said. "Some of you know me well. I've been ranching in this valley for 20 years, and I haven't asked much from this community, and it hasn't asked much from me, and that's been a workable arrangement." He paused. "I want to address something directly, because I'm tired of addressing it indirectly." The room was very still. "My wife came to this marriage in circumstances that weren't fully her choice," he said. "I want to be honest about that because some of you already know it, and the rest of you have probably guessed. Her family had debts. I had means. An arrangement was made." He looked out across the pews. What I want you to understand is that the arrangement was the beginning of the story, not the whole of it. He reached into his jacket and produced a document. She could see it from where she sat, the formal paper of a deed. I'm filing this with the county recorder on Monday morning, he said. It transfers 200 acres of creek bottom land on the east section of the Mercer Ranch into my wife's name. Her name alone. To use as she sees fit, to sell if she chooses, to keep if she chooses, to pass on as she decides. He held the document up so the room could see it, not waving it, just acknowledging its existence. I want every person in this room to understand what that means. It means Abigail Mercer is not a woman I took on out of pity or debt or limited options. She is a landowner in this territory, with 200 acres of some of the best ground in this valley, because she has earned it and because she is my equal in this marriage, and I want that to be a matter of public record. He sat down. The church was silent in a way that churches rarely are. Not the held-breath silence of scandal, but the denser silence of a room full of people rearranging their understanding of something. Reverend Clay said, "Mrs. Mercer," with a look that suggested Gideon had given him some advance notice after all. Abigail stood. She had thought about what she wanted to say. She had written some of it in the field notebook, which was not a place for speeches, but was the place where she worked things through honestly. And what she'd arrived at after 2 days of writing and crossing out and writing again was this. She was not going to be eloquent. She was not a practiced speaker. But she was going to say true things, and true things didn't need to be dressed up. She looked at the congregation. She saw Ruth Packard in the third row with an expression that was impossible to read. She saw Louise Voss near the side window, watching with something that might have been holding its breath in her favor. She saw Carl Packard looking at his hat. She saw Walt and Pete in the back row, who had apparently decided to come to church this particular Sunday, which told her Gideon had mentioned something to them, and she felt a complicated warmth about that. "I want to say something about why I'm staying," she said. Her voice was even. She was grateful for that. "When I came here last November, I was 19 years old, and I had been told my whole life, in ways both direct and indirect, that I was not what people wanted, that my body was a problem, that I was something to be managed or endured, or if a person was being charitable, pitied." She paused. I believed some of that. Not all of it, because some part of me always argued back. But enough of it that when I arrived here, I was mostly waiting to find out which version of not enough I was going to turn out to be in this particular situation. The room was still very quiet. "What I found instead," she said, "was a man who talked to me about soil drainage on our first night of marriage, who showed me the pasture that was failing and asked what I thought, who listened to what I said and acted on it, who sent a bank draft to cover my family's remaining debt and called it family, not a favor." She looked at Gideon, who was looking at the floor in the particular way of a man who finds direct acknowledgement uncomfortable and is enduring it. "I am not staying in this marriage because I was forced into it. I'm staying because Gideon Mercer is the first person in my life who looked at me, all of me, and saw a person worth knowing. Not a problem, not a charity case. A person." She let that sit for a moment. "I know what some of you have said about this marriage," she said, and her voice was still even, still clear, though her hands were gripping the pew back in front of her harder than they needed to. "I know about the pity and the convenient choices and the wondering what he was thinking. I'm not angry about it. People make assessments with the information they have." She looked at Ruth Packard directly. "I'm here today so you have more information." She sat down. The silence held for another moment. Then Reverend Clay said something that started the closing of the service, and the congregation began to move, and the world resumed its ordinary sound and motion, and Abigail sat in the pew and breathed and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, which was considerable. Gideon's hand found hers on the pew between them. Not dramatically, just his hand moving to cover hers, steady and warm and there. She turned hers over and held it. The congregation filed out of the church with the slightly dazed quality of people who had come in expecting one thing and experienced another. Abigail and Gideon stood on the front steps, and the community moved around them in ways that told her a great deal about who various people were. Carl Packard walked past without speaking, which was its own statement. Ruth Packard stopped. She stopped directly in front of Abigail, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and Abigail looked at her steadily and waited. "I owe you an apology," Ruth Packard said. The words came out stiffly, like something being carried with effort. "Several, probably." Abigail looked at her. "Yes," she said. Not graciously, not yet. She wasn't there yet, and pretending otherwise would have been false. "You do." Ruth Packard nodded once, tightly, and moved on. It wasn't a transformation. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was a woman acknowledging an account that was outstanding, and whether she would settle it remained to be seen. But it was something she hadn't offered in 8 months. Louise Voss was more direct. She came to Abigail and took both her hands, which was unexpected, and said, "I've been wanting to say since February that the North pasture looks better than it has in 10 years. And there was something in her face that was genuine respect, the kind you can't manufacture. And Abigail gripped her hands back and said, "Thank you for noticing." Old Doyle from the telegraph office shook Gideon's hand and said, "Good man," which was the entirety of his contribution, but landed solidly. The broad-shouldered man who'd been at the wedding, she knew him now as Frank Alderman, who ran cattle on the north end of the valley, came and stood with them on the steps for a few minutes and said that he'd had a drainage problem on his east pasture for 5 years and wondered if Abigail might have time to look at it sometime. "I could come out next week," she said. "That'd be much appreciated," Frank said, and shook her hand. When the steps had finally cleared and only Reverend Clay remained to lock the church doors, he came and stood with them for a moment, a lean, quiet man in his 60s who had been watching the morning's proceedings with an expression of careful attention. "That was a brave thing," he said to them both. "It needed doing," Gideon said, which was how he responded to most things. Reverend Clay looked at Abigail. "I knew your husband when he first came to this valley," he said. "He was 20 years old and he had 40 acres and a plan that everyone else thought was too ambitious. Half the people in this county told him he was wrong." A small pause. "He wasn't wrong." She looked at Gideon. "He's good at knowing what's worth keeping," Reverend Clay said, and went back inside to lock his church. What? They drove home in the afternoon light, the road quiet and warm, the summer country spread out around them in every direction. About halfway, Gideon said, "You didn't tell me you were going to say all of that." "You didn't tell me you were going to give me 200 acres, she said. "Fair," he said. She looked at the road ahead. "Was it too much? What I said?" "No," he said, without hesitation. "It was right." Ruth Packard looked like she'd swallowed something unpleasant. "Ruth Packard has swallowed something unpleasant," he said. "Her own record of the last 8 months." She looked at him sideways. "That's the closest thing to a sharp remark I've ever heard from you." "I have them," he said. "I just don't use them much. They're expensive." She laughed. The genuine kind, the easy kind, the kind that had started coming more often and that she'd stopped measuring before it arrived. He glanced at her, and something in his face when he heard her laugh was so plain and unguarded that she had to look away, back at the road, because there are moments of happiness that you need a moment to contain before you can look at them directly. The ranch came over the rise ahead of them, the barns and the house, and the cottonwoods and the creek glinting in the afternoon sun, and the north pasture green and full, and the east section, or her 200 acres, a fact she was still in the process of believing, visible beyond the fence line, the mature timber on the north end dark against the summer sky. "I want to plant something," she said. He glanced at her. "On the east section?" "Trees. Fruit trees." "Well," she was thinking it through as she said it. "Apple and pear, mostly. Some cherry. A proper orchard." She looked at the land as they pulled through the gate. "It takes years to come in, but it's the right soil for it, and the creek access is good for irrigation." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it the way he thought about everything. Not dismissing it, not immediately endorsing it, just letting it be real in his mind. "An orchard takes 5-6 years before you see fruit," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You're planning that far ahead." She met his eyes. "I'm planning to be here," she said. "That far ahead and further." The wagon rolled up to the barn. Walt and Pete were there. They'd come back from church ahead of them and already had their work clothes on because Walt's version of a sacred observation was a day when the morning's unusual events didn't delay the afternoon's work by more than an hour. Walt came to take the horse. He looked at them both. "How'd it go?" he said. Well enough, Gideon said. Walt nodded. He looked at Abigail. Frank Alderman talked to me after, he said, about his east pasture. I know, she said. I'm going out next week to look at it. Walt took the horse's head and led him toward the barn. Good, he said, over his shoulder. Pete was hovering near the barn door with the particular anxious energy of a young man who wanted to ask something but wasn't sure of the protocol. He looked at Abigail. The alderman job, he said. Would you, if you needed an extra hand for the drainage work, I know how to dig now. She looked at him. 18 years old, still figuring out who he was, and this was his way of saying he'd picked a side. I'll let you know, she said. He nodded, satisfied, and disappeared into the barn. She stood in the yard for a moment in the afternoon heat, looking at the east section beyond the fence. 200 acres. Her name on the deed, which would be filed Monday morning at the county recorder's office, and would sit in the official record of this territory for as long as records were kept. Gideon came to stand beside her. You're looking at the orchard, he said. I'm looking at where the first row should go, she said. You want the south-facing slope for the apple varieties. They need the most sun. He looked at the slope. That's the section with the natural windbreak on the west side. Exactly, she said. It'll extend the growing season by 2 or 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment, both of them looking at the land. You've already drawn it up, he said. In the field notebook. She had actually. 3 nights ago, sitting at the kitchen table after supper while he worked on his accounts, she had sketched the orchard layout from memory of the terrain, the row spacing, the variety placement, the irrigation channels from the creek. She hadn't told him because she hadn't decided yet if she was going to stay. And then she had decided, and the notebook had been sitting open on the table the next morning when he came down for coffee, and he had looked at it and not said anything, just closed it and set it carefully to one side. You saw it, she said. I saw it, he said. Why didn't you say anything? Because it wasn't my decision whether you were going to be here to plant it, he said. That was yours. She looked at him. He was looking at the land, his hands in his jacket pockets, the afternoon light on the side of his face. I'm going to need to order the saplings this fall for spring planting, she said. It's a significant cost in the first year. I know, he said. I'll pay for it from the orchard account once it's producing. I know you will, he said. I'm telling you the plan, not asking permission. He looked at her. I know that too, he said, and the way he said it, quiet and certain, without any friction in it, told her that he had understood this from the beginning, that the land was hers now, and what grew on it would be her decision, and that he was not the kind of man who gave a thing and then kept a hand on it. The afternoon moved toward evening around them, the shadows lengthening across the yard, the smell of the land warm and full in the summer air. Inside, Dolores would be starting supper. In the barn, Walt and Pete would be finishing the evening feed. Tomorrow there would be fence work and cattle to move and the ongoing business of 600 acres of working ranch that did not pause for significant Sundays. But for this moment, they stood in the yard and looked at 200 acres of land that was hers. And the future was not a closed door or a borrowed dress or someone else's solution to someone else's problem. It was ground, actual ground, measured and deeded and real. And she was going to plant something on it that would be there long after the current chapter of Whispers and Social Sundays and other people's assessments had faded into the ordinary background of a life being lived forward. She turned and went inside to help with supper, and the evening came on soft and warm, and for the first time in a long time, tomorrow felt like something she was moving toward rather than something she was surviving until. The saplings arrived on a Thursday in late March, 2 weeks after the last frost, packed in damp burlap and wooden crates that took 3 men and the better part of a morning to unload from the freight wagon. 42 apple trees, 18 pear, 9 cherry, 69 trees in all, bare-rooted and dormant, looking like nothing so much as a collection of sticks bundled together, which was more or less what they were. Pete stood looking at the crates with an expression of mild skepticism. These are going to be trees, he said. In about 5 years, yes, Abigail said. They look dead. They're dormant. There's a difference. She checked the root ball on the nearest bundle. Moist, healthy, the fine roots intact. Same as everything else that's waiting for the right conditions to come back. Pete considered this with the look of a young man deciding whether the observation had a second meaning and then went to get a shovel. She had spent the winter planning it properly. Not just in the field notebook. though the notebook was now entirely full and she'd started a second one. But in conversation with a pomologist she'd written to in Kansas City after finding his name in an agricultural journal that Walt had inexplicably been using to prop up a loose leg on the tackroom shelf. The man had written back a letter of 4 pages that Gideon had looked at over her shoulder with the expression he wore when something impressed him and he didn't want to make too much of it. The letter covered variety selection, row spacing for the terrain she'd described, pollination pairing for the apple varieties, and irrigation scheduling from creek access. She had incorporated all of it into the planting plan, which she'd drawn in pencil on a large sheet of drafting paper pinned to the wall of the small room off the kitchen that had, over the course of the winter, become her office. She had an office. The room had been a storage space, good-sized, east-facing window, shelves along one wall. In November, she would not have claimed a room in this house for herself. By January, she had quietly moved the stored goods to the barn and put her drafting table in the east window and her second field notebook on the shelf and said nothing about it to anyone, and nobody said anything about it to her. And one morning she came in to find that Dolores had set a small pot of dried flowers on the windowsill, which was as close as Dolores got to a declaration. The planting took 4 days. She and Pete and Walt and 2 men borrowed from Frank Alderman's ranch, who had started sending men to help on the Mercer property in a quiet, reciprocal arrangement that had developed naturally from Abigail's work on his east pasture drainage the previous summer, dug holes to her specified depths and spacing, set each tree, tamped the soil, staked the young trunks against the spring winds that came off the ridge. Gideon worked the first day and then stayed away, because he understood this was her project, and the most useful thing he could do was give her room to run it. On the 4th evening, when the last tree was in the ground and she walked the rows in the low light counting stakes, she felt something she had no ready word for. Not pride exactly, though it was there. Something older and quieter than pride. The satisfaction of having put something real into the ground that would still be there when all the opinions and the whispers and the Sunday morning social calculations had long since dissolved into the ordinary dust of days that didn't end up mattering. She stood in the middle of the new orchard in the fading light and looked at 69 dormant trees and thought about how long a life actually is and how much can grow in it if you give the right things room. The shift in town was not a revolution. She had not expected a revolution. What she had expected was exactly what occurred, a slow, grudging, uneven renegotiation of how the community of Caldwell Creek understood who she was, conducted mostly without direct acknowledgement of the fact that any renegotiation was occurring. Ruth Packard was the most legible case. The woman never offered a formal apology beyond that tight, effortful acknowledgement on the church steps. Abigail had not expected more, and would have been suspicious of more. What she offered instead over the following months was a studied correctness, the kind of deliberate civility that costs the person practicing it something and is therefore more honest than easy warmth would have been. She said good morning and meant it to be received as good morning. She did not say more than that for a long time. It was in November, exactly 1 year after Abigail had arrived on the frontier, that Ruth Packard came to the dry goods on a Tuesday morning when Abigail happened to be there collecting a supply order. And after the initial pleasantries, Ruth said, in a voice that was clipped and direct as if she needed to get it out before she reconsidered, "My daughter Eliza has a piece of land on the south end of our property that's been giving us trouble for 3 seasons. Wet soil, poor grass. Vince says it's just a bad piece of ground." She stopped. "I don't think it's just a bad piece of ground." Abigail looked at her. "I'd like your opinion," Ruth said, "if you're willing." The room was quiet. "Tell me what the drainage looks like on the west edge," Abigail said. Ruth told her, and Abigail asked 2 more questions, and by the end of the conversation she'd told her what the problem likely was and how to address it, and Ruth had listened with the focused attention of a woman who, whatever her social failings, was not too proud to learn something useful. "Thank you," Ruth said. "Send word when you want someone to look at it," Abigail said. She went out to the wagon and sat for a moment before she picked up the reins. 1 year. The woman who had called her husband a man who had made the charitable choice was now asking her to fix a broken pasture. She didn't take satisfaction in it the way she might have in the early days, when the hurt was fresh enough to want some version of accounting. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable. The recognition that things do sometimes change, that the same people who build their comfortable certainties on the backs of other people's inadequacies can be moved, can reconsider, can arrive at something more honest, if enough time and enough evidence conspires to make denial more work than revision. She picked up the reins and drove home. Thomas came to visit in June of the second year. He arrived on the afternoon stage, thin and browned from working outdoors, with a battered bag and the slightly overwhelmed look of a man encountering 6,000 acres of working ranch for the first time. He stood in the yard and turned in a slow circle. "Abby," he said. "I know," she said. "This is—" He turned another circle. "Abby, you already said that. I don't have a different word for it." She showed him the ranch, and then she walked him out to the orchard, which was in its second spring and beginning to show the small but unmistakable signs of what it would become. Buds on the apple varieties that were ahead of schedule, the pear trees with a new density of growth that the pomologist had said was a good indicator of root establishment. It looked less like sticks now, and more like a real thing in the process of becoming. Thomas walked the rows slowly, touching the small new leaves on one of the apple trees. "You planted all of these," he said. "With help," she said. "But this was yours. The planting was mine." He stood in the middle of the orchard and looked at her with an expression that undid something in her chest the way her mother's silent hug at the church had undone something, which was the particular power of being seen clearly by someone who knew where you had come from. "You were so unhappy," he said, "when Pa told you. I knew you were, and I didn't. I should have said something. I should have done something." "You were 19, she said. "What would you have done?" "I don't know. Something. Anything." He looked at the trees. "I just stood there." "Thomas," she said. He looked at her. "Look where I am," she said. "Look at what I have." She gestured at the orchard, and beyond it at the 200 acres of her land under the summer sky. "I'm not saying what Pa did was right. It wasn't. I'm saying it brought me somewhere I wouldn't have found otherwise, and where I am now is good." She held his gaze. "That doesn't excuse the way it started, but it's the whole truth, and I want you to have the whole truth." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you happy?" She thought about what the word meant and whether she was using it right when she said yes, because happiness was not what she would have called the thing she lived with daily. It was more textured than happiness, rougher in places, with the kind of weight that comes from things meaning something. There were hard days. There were days when the old voices came back, the accumulated record of everyone who'd looked at her and found her lacking, and she had to sit with them and wait for them to pass rather than pretending they weren't there. There were days when the work was overwhelming and the weather was bad, and the accounts didn't reconcile, and she and Gideon disagreed about something directly enough that supper was a quiet meal. But underneath all of that, in the place where the actual orientation of her life lived, the answer was yes. "Yes," she said, "I am." Thomas nodded. He looked at the orchard again. "What are you going to do with all the apples when they come in?" "Sell some. Press some for cider. Give some away." She paused. "I'm thinking about a small operation. Processed preserves, maybe. There's a market in Wichita that buys from orchard producers." He blinked. "You've already researched the market." "I had a lot of winter evenings." He laughed then, the full open laugh she remembered from when they were children, before the farm started failing and the laughing got quieter. She hadn't heard it in a long time, and it surprised her by how much she'd missed it. Gideon met Thomas at supper, and they shook hands and felt each other out in the careful way of men who are important to the same woman and are therefore obligated to figure out where they stand. And by the end of the evening, they were talking about cattle weights and land management in the way that people do when they've decided they can respect each other without having to make a production of it. Thomas helped Walt with the morning feed the next day without being asked, which Walt received with the nearest thing to approval he showed new people. When Thomas left 3 days later, he hugged her at the wagon with the grip of someone who has seen a thing and been changed by seeing it. "Write more often," he said. "You write more often," she said. I mean it. I want to know how the orchard comes in." "You'll hear about it," she said. "I promise." She watched the stage pull out of the yard and stood in the dust it left until it was gone around the bend. And then she went back to her office and opened the second field notebook and wrote down the apple bud count she'd done that morning, because the work didn't pause for the moments that matter. And that was one of the things she'd learned to be grateful for, rather than resentful of. The orchard came into its first real fruit in the 4th year. Not full production. That would take another season or two, and she knew that. She'd always known that. But enough. The apple trees were heavy in late August, the variety she'd positioned on the south-facing slope exactly as the pomologist had suggested. And the pears came in 2 weeks later, and even the cherry trees, which had been slower than she'd hoped, managed a respectable showing in June. She picked the first apple herself, standing on a wooden step stool she'd made Pete build to the exact right height for the rows. On a morning in late August, when the air had the particular quality it gets at the end of a good summer, still warm, but with the first suggestion of what's coming in it, like a sentence that isn't finished yet. She held the apple for a moment before she bit into it. It was not a remarkable-looking thing. The right color, the right size, nothing to distinguish it from any other apple of its variety. But it had come out of her ground, from trees she had planted and irrigated and pruned and monitored for 4 years, on land that had been hers by the choice of a man who had looked at her and decided she was worth it. She bit into it. It was good. Not transcendent. She would have been suspicious of transcendent, because nothing that takes 4 years of work reveals itself in a single moment. It was just a good apple, firm and slightly tart, and it tasted like exactly what it was. She climbed down from the step stool and walked back to the house to get the picking baskets. The processing operation she'd been planning since before the first tree was in the ground came together in the 5th year, and a stone building she'd had constructed on the east section using money from the first 2 seasons of apple sales. It wasn't large, 4 rooms, good ventilation, a proper floor that could be cleaned, but it was built right, and by the 2nd season of operation, it employed 3 women from Caldwell Creek who came out 3 days a week during processing season to put up preserves and cider and dried fruit under Abigail's direction. One of the women was Louise Voss, who had left her mother's dry goods the previous year after a disagreement about the terms of her employment there that she declined to discuss in detail, but whose outline was not hard to deduce. She was quick and competent, and had strong opinions about cider sweetness that Abigail argued with and lost about twice before conceding she was right. The second was a young woman named Clara Dent, whose husband had a small claim on the north end of the valley, and who needed the income, and who turned out to have a talent for the precise, patient work of preserving that made her invaluable within the first month. The third was, in one of those turns that life makes without consulting you, Eliza Packard, Ruth Packard's daughter, 19 years old and newly married and sharp-minded in a way her mother had perhaps not given her room to be at home. She came for the money and stayed because she was good at it and because the operation treated her like someone whose competence was worth something. Ruth Packard, when she found out, said nothing negative about it. That was progress of a kind. The preserves operation turned a profit in its 2nd full year. Not a large profit. They were selling into a market that was competitive and paying for labor and materials that were not cheap, but real profit, documented in the accounts that Abigail kept with the same methodical attention she'd brought to everything since the household books in that first winter. She showed the numbers to Gideon one evening in the sitting room, and he looked at them for a long time and then looked at her and said, "You're going to need a larger building." "I know," she said. "I'm already drawing it." He almost smiled. "Of course you are." "The north wall of the current building can become an interior wall if we extend east," she said. "It saves the cost of—" "Abigail," he said. She stopped. "I know you've already figured it out," he said. "I'm just telling you the money's there when you need it." She looked at him. "I want to use the orchard profit for the expansion." "All right." "Not your money." "All right," he said again, without friction, without the slight hardening that some men show when a woman insists on the distinction. Just, "All right, it's yours. Do it your way." She went back to the drawing. There is something particular about being 24 years old in a body that has been argued over by other people for as long as you can remember, and arriving one ordinary morning at a place where the argument no longer interests you. It didn't happen with ceremony. She didn't wake up one day cured of every old wound. That would have been too clean, too final, and life on the frontier had taught her a bone-deep skepticism about clean finality. What happened instead was gradual and cumulative and honestly a little boring, which is how most of the important things happen. She woke up one morning in the 5th year on the ranch, went to the window, looked at the orchard beginning to come into its September color, and realized that what she felt looking at it was not complicated by anyone else's opinion of her. Not that those opinions had vanished. Ruth Packard still had days where the old assessment surfaced in some small but recognizable form. There were still people in Caldwell Creek who had never revised their view of how the Mercer marriage had come about and what it meant about the relative worth of the parties involved. There were still mornings when she caught her own reflection and heard, faintly, the old voices with their long record of commentary. But the voices had become background rather than foreground. They'd lost the power to set the terms of how she moved through her own day. And the thing that had displaced them was not some internal monologue of self-affirmation. She had no patience for that. It always felt like a performance she was putting on for an audience that wasn't there. What had displaced them was simpler and harder won, the accumulated evidence of her own competence. 69 trees in the ground that were producing, an operation that employed 3 women and turned a profit, a pasture that had been dead 3 years and was now the best grass on the ranch, a second field notebook full, and a third one started. You can tell a person they have worth until you are both exhausted from the telling, and some part of them will keep asking for proof. The proof is what builds over time in the space between what you attempted and what you made real. She had been making things real for 5 years. One afternoon in October of that 5th year, she was in the orchard doing the end-of-season inspection, checking for any disease signs in the bark, noting which trees would need heavier pruning in the spring, recording yields in the field notebook, when she became aware that she was not alone. She looked up to find a girl of about 12 standing at the edge of the orchard, watching her. She didn't recognize her. A thin, serious-faced child with dark braids, and the look of someone who has walked some distance to be somewhere. "Are you Mrs. Mercer?" the girl said. "I am," Abigail said. "My mother says you're the one who fixed the Alderman pasture," the girl said, "and the Packard South field, and the drainage on your own land." "That's right." The girl looked at the trees. "How did you know how to do all that?" Abigail looked at her for a moment. She thought about the county extension office in her father's county, the man who had been surprised to see a girl asking soil questions and had answered her anyway. She thought about the summer she was 14, alone in the field with a shovel and a piece of paper covered in her own rough calculations. "I started with what I needed to know," she said. "And then I found out who knew more than me, and I asked them questions." The girl considered this. "What if they won't answer you?" "Some won't," Abigail said. "Yeah, you find the ones who will." The girl was quiet for a moment, looking at the trees. "My father says women don't know about land," she said. Not maliciously, just reporting a fact she'd been given and wasn't sure she trusted. Abigail looked at her steadily. "What does your father's Southfield look like this time of year?" The girl blinked. "Thin, patchy. He says it's the soil." "It might be," Abigail said. "Or it might be drainage. You'd have to look at where the water sits after rain." She pulled a clean page from the back of the field notebook and wrote on it what to look for, how to check the soil depth, what the signs of hardpan looked like. She tore the page out and held it out to the girl. "Try this." The girl took the paper and read it with the focused attention of someone who means to use what's being given to them. "Thank you," she said. "What's your name?" Abigail said. "Mary Sutton." "Come back and tell me what you find, Mary Sutton." Mary Sutton folded the paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket and walked back the way she'd come, and Abigail watched her go and felt something that lived just past the ordinary edges of satisfaction. She went back to her inspection. That night at supper, she told Gideon about the girl. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without hurrying her toward the point. "Sutton," he said. "James Sutton's daughter. He runs a small place about 4 miles east." "She walked 4 miles to ask me a question," Abigail said. He looked at her. "That's a determined child." "Yes," she said. "It is." She ate her supper and thought about determination and what it looks like in a 12-year-old girl who has been told something false by someone who should know better and who goes looking for a different answer anyway. She thought about herself at 12, at 14, at 19, standing in the aisle of a church in a borrowed dress that didn't fit, walking toward a man she didn't know in a life she hadn't chosen. The distance between that girl and the woman sitting at this table with this supper in front of her was not as long in years as it felt. 5 years and 3 months since the wedding. A little over 5 years of ground and work and cold mornings and difficult evenings, and the slow accretion of things built, things understood, things grown. It was not a tidy distance. It had not gone in a straight line. There had been the night with the half-packed bag and the 2 a.m., conversation at the door, and there had been Ruth Packard's words through the food table and the sick particular exhaustion of surviving instead of attending, and there had been winter mornings when the loneliness of her old life sat on her chest like a stone, and she had to work around it rather than through it because there was no through, only the long way around. There had been disagreements with Gideon that left the evening quiet in ways that required repair, and the repair was not always swift or graceful. She would not trade any of it. That was the thing she'd arrived at, somewhere between the first field notebook and the third. Not that the hard parts had been worth it in some abstract redemptive sense, but that they were part of the whole, and the whole was hers, and she was finished wishing it had been easier. Gideon cleared his plate and set his fork down and looked at her with that steady, attentive look. "You're thinking about something," he said. "I'm thinking about 5 years," she said. "And?" She looked at him across the table, this man who had driven her 30 miles in November cold, and talked to her about soil drainage instead of pretending the situation was something other than what it was, who had said, "It's not alone, it's family," who had stood in a church and held a deed over his head and said she was his equal in front of everyone who needed to hear it, who had sat in a chair by the window at 2 a.m. and told her she had a real choice and meant it. "And I think I made the right one," she said. He held her gaze. "Which one?" "The morning after I packed the bag," she said. "I unpacked it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the October night was clear and cold, the stars already out over the ridge. In the barn, the horses were settled. The orchard stood dark against the sky, 69 trees in their rows. Leaves mostly down now, waiting in the way things wait when they know what's coming and are prepared for it. "So did I," he said. She looked at him. "When I agreed to meet you," he said, "instead of just taking the land as payment." He held her gaze, and there was nothing hidden in his face, no composure performing over something else. "I made the right one." She reached across the table and set her hand on his, and he turned his hand over and held it, and neither of them said anything more, because there wasn't anything more to say that the moment didn't already contain. Mary Sutton came back 3 weeks later. She knocked on the kitchen door on a Saturday morning, and Dolores let her in with the pragmatic hospitality of a woman who has seen enough of the world to understand that a 12-year-old who walks 4 miles twice deserves at least a cup of cocoa. She sat at the kitchen table across from Abigail with her coat still on and reported what she'd found in her father's south field with the precision of someone who had done the test correctly. "Hard pan," she said. "About 5 inches down. Water pooled in the low corner after the rain last week, just like the paper said it would." "What does that tell you?" Abigail said. "That it's not just bad soil," Mary said. "It's a drainage problem. You can fix a drainage problem." "You can," Abigail said. "What did your father say?" A pause. "I haven't told him yet." "Why not?" Mary looked at her hands around the cocoa cup. "Because he'll say I got it wrong." Abigail looked at this 12-year-old girl who had walked 8 miles in total on 2 separate occasions to be told something true, and thought about all the ways the world tells people like them. Girls with opinions, women who know things that men have decided women shouldn't know, that they got it wrong before it even looks at what they found. "Here's what I know," Abigail said. "You did the test right. You read the results right. You came back and reported it accurately." She met the girl's eyes. "You didn't get it wrong." Mary looked at her. "If your father says you got it wrong without looking at the field," Abigail said, "then ask him to look at the field with you. Let the field be the answer, not either of you." Mary was quiet for a moment, digesting this. "And if he still won't listen," she said. "Then you know something important," Abigail said, "that the field is still broken, and that you know how to fix it, and that eventually someone will ask why the south field looks the way it does, and you'll be the one with the answer." Mary looked at her for a long time. Then she nodded once, the way Walt nodded, the full, decided kind. She finished the cocoa, thanked Dolores, and put her coat back on. At the kitchen door, she stopped. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, "did people tell you that you got things wrong?" "All the time," Abigail said. "What did you do?" Abigail thought about it honestly. I kept records, she said. I wrote down what I observed and what I tried and what happened, so that when someone told me I was wrong, I had the thing itself to point to. She looked at the girl. The work doesn't lie. People lie. The work doesn't. Mary Sutton nodded again. She opened the door and went out into the October morning, and Abigail stood at the kitchen window and watched her cross the yard toward the road. Dolores said from behind her, "You're going to end up teaching that child everything you know." "Probably," Abigail said. "She's got good sense." "She walked 4 miles twice because she wanted the truth," Abigail said. "That's better than good sense. That's character." She never set out to become what she became in Caldwell Creek. She hadn't come here with any ambition larger than surviving the situation she'd been handed. An ambition that size was already considerable for a girl who'd spent her life being told her size was the most important thing about her. What she became happened the way most things happen. Not through a single decisive act, but through the accumulation of small ones, each ordinary in isolation, each placing a next stone in a path that only becomes visible when you turn around and look at how far you've come. By the 6th year of her marriage, the Mercer Orchard operation was known throughout the territory. Not famous. She had no interest in famous, which she'd observed required you to let other people define what you were, and she was done with that. But known. Known in the specific way of a thing that does what it says and can be relied on. 3 times that year, she was asked to consult on land problems by families she'd never met, referred by someone who had been referred by someone else, the network of word of mouth that is the only currency that actually means something on the frontier. She helped a family 20 miles north fix a failing wheat crop by identifying a root fungus problem that had been misdiagnosed as drought damage. She helped a woman running a homestead alone after her husband's death the previous winter assess the viability of her soil for expanded production. She wrote a letter to the county agricultural office suggesting a standard protocol for drainage assessment in the territory that they sent back with a note saying they found it useful and had forwarded it to the territorial office in Topeka. None of this made her the most important person in Caldwell Creek. The most important people in Caldwell Creek were the ones who'd always been the most important people in Caldwell Creek, and social hierarchies on the frontier as elsewhere do not reorganize themselves completely just because one person demonstrates notable competence. Ruth Packard still occupied her position. Harriet Voss still set the tone at the dry goods. The old arrangements persisted in most of their essential forms, but within that landscape, a space had been made. Not given, she had made it herself, with 4 years of planting and 2 years of processing and 6 years of doing the work and letting the work be its own argument. A space where Abigail Mercer was not explained by her appearance or her origins or the unusual circumstances of her marriage, but by what she actually was. A woman who understood land, who built things that lasted, who told you the truth and kept records to prove it. That was not everything. It was not the world remade into fairness, because the world does not remake itself into fairness. It shifts incrementally under the specific gravity of specific people doing specific things that accumulate over time. She had applied some of that gravity. She would continue to apply it. Mary Sutton would apply some of it in her turn if she kept walking 4 miles to ask the right questions. That was how it worked. Not through grand declarations, though declarations had their place. She thought sometimes about Gideon standing in that church with the deed and felt something fierce and permanent about it, but through the ordinary long work of being consistently, undeniably, documentably yourself. One evening in the 7th year, she and Gideon walked the orchard after supper in the long summer light. It was a habit they developed somewhere in the 2nd year without deciding to. The evening walk, usually through whatever part of the property was most on their minds, talking about what needed doing, or sometimes not talking at all. The orchard was her regular route. He came with her most evenings now. The trees were full and heavy. She had added a 4th row of apple trees the previous spring, a late ripening variety that would extend the harvest season, and they were establishing well. The processing building's east extension was complete and had been running for 2 seasons. She walked slowly, looking at each tree the way she'd always looked at them. Not with satisfaction exactly, though that was part of it, but with the particular attention of someone responsible for something alive. Trees had bad years. They got disease. A late frost could set the cherry crop back 3 seasons. She didn't look at the orchard and see perfection. She looked at it and saw what was real, which was better. "Tom Sutton came to see me today," Gideon said. She glanced at him. "James Sutton's boy?" "The father, James." He was looking at the trees as they walked. He wanted to talk about the south field. Apparently it's been repaired and the grass is coming in. "Mary did that," Abigail said. "She figured out the problem herself. I just confirmed it." "He seemed to know that," Gideon said. "He seemed not comfortable saying it, but he knew." A pause. "He wanted to know if his daughter could come here on Saturdays to learn." Abigail stopped walking. "Learn what?" she said. "Everything you know, apparently," Gideon said. He said Mary told him she wanted to do land work, that she was going to do it whether he approved or not, but she'd rather do it with his approval. He glanced at her. "He was asking if you'd take her on." She stood in the orchard in the evening light and looked at the trees for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was your decision," Gideon said. "Not mine." She looked at him. "Your operation," he said. "Your knowledge. Your choice." She thought about Mary Sutton at the kitchen table with her coat still on and her hands around a cocoa cup, reporting her findings with the precision of someone who has done the work right and knows it. She thought about the field notebook she'd given her. She had, it turned out, given Mary one of her spare notebooks the second visit, with instructions to start keeping records, and Mary had come back a month later with 6 weeks of observations in it in cramped, careful handwriting. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you'll take her?" "Yes," she said. He nodded. They walked on through the orchard, the last light going gold and low through the trees, the evening sounds of the ranch settling around them. "Gideon," she said. "Yes." "Do you remember the first night? At supper. You said—" She thought about how to say it. "You said you wanted a person, in the house, at the table." He looked at her, and the look had in it the full accumulation of 7 years, everything built, and everything survived, and everything chosen. "Yes," he said. "I want you to know that it goes the same way," she said. "For me. That's not a small thing, what you said. It was the most important thing anyone's ever said to me." He was quiet for a moment. "You are not a small thing," he said. "You never were." She took his arm as they walked. Not dramatically, just naturally. The way you take the arm of someone you have been beside long enough that it is simply what your body does when you are walking next to them. The orchard held them in its rows, 69 original trees plus 4 rows more, 11 years from the ground to this evening, all of it growing, all of it hers. There are things that the world tells women like Abigail Brooks, girls who take up space, who don't fit the shape that's been prepared for them, who arrive in borrowed dresses and leave the marriage ceremony already half mourning the lives they'd imagined. The world tells them that their worth is conditional, that they must earn the right to be seen by first becoming something other than what they are, that the love they receive will always have a question mark at the end of it, a caveat, a but. What Abigail had learned, not in a single revelation, but over 7 years of cold mornings and broken pastures and late-night decisions and trees that took years to fruit, was that the world is wrong about this, and that proving it wrong is not a matter of argument, but of presence, of showing up, again, and doing the work, again, and keeping the record so that when someone tells you that you got it wrong, you have the thing itself to show them. She had the orchard, she had the notebooks, she had the field notes on 60-odd land assessments in 6 different counties. She had an operation that employed 3 women and a reputation that had traveled on the testimony of the land itself, which does not lie. And she had this, a man walking beside her in the evening, and a girl who was going to come on Saturdays to learn what she knew. And 69 trees that were older now than the woman who had planted them had been when the whole story began. She walked through the last row and out the far end of the orchard and stood for a moment looking back at it in the fading light. All that she had put in the ground, all that had come up from it, all that was still coming. Then she turned toward the house, and the evening came on around her, and the life that had been waiting all along continued.